All right. Welcome, welcome. No, you're not late. If anything, I'm late. My tea was steeping and I went upstairs to go and get it. So if anyone's late, it's probably me. But it's not cozy corner if we don't have some nice tea, right? Hang on, where's my background music? Was I using this one? Hopefully that's not super loud. Oh, that's not super loud. That's nice and perfect. That's the volume I wanted it at. Perfect. You're not cozy because you're working out. I mean, something satisfying about working out. It's kind of cozy. It's not like traditional cozy, but depends on the workout. Fair enough. Yeah, some are not as cozy. Some are pretty brutal, but afterwards, when you're all like exhausted, it's kind of comfy. It's kind of comfy, right? I don't know. Exercise, like the pain you get after exercise is kind of a nice sort of pain. Bulgarian back squats are very comfy. Fair enough. All right. So, we're back again with another Cozy Corner book club, and we'll get back into it fairly soon. I usually leave a little bit of a space for people to trickle in on these streams, so that people don't miss the beginning and get all sad. But we're part of the way through the book now, so I suppose I don't really need to do that. You'll be having some chamomile while you work on maps later, so you will be cozy, just not right now. Fair enough. Fair enough. Um, yeah, I'm drinking a jasmine, which I just almost burnt my tongue on because it's really hot, hotter than I was expecting. I thought maybe it'd cooled off a little bit, but it's nope, nope. Got to explore a abandoned Pier 1 imports today. Very fun. That does sound kind of fun, actually. You find any treasure? Any hidden treasure? They had a spooky back room that turned out to be their break room. Finding treasure chest in a Pier 1? Yeah, why not? They might have one. You never know. Alright, so if you're unfamiliar, the book that we're reading is called Anne of Green Gables. I don't know if you get that's where you'd hide your treasure. Yeah, exactly. No one would be looking for it then. No one but real treasure hunters would know. Practicing priest for your new job and you needed a space for it? I see. What? Curious why they had access to an abandoned Pier 1 import, but that's alright. Alright. Okay. So, book that we're reading today for the unfamiliar is Anne of Green Gables. It's this one right here. Big book. I'm making it float really close to your face. It's not big. It's an optical illusion, that's all. You're a game master for an escape room? That sounds fun. Under construction, so the property manager gave you access? I see. That makes sense then. Yeah, so Anna Green Gables by L.M. Montgomery is the book that we're reading. It's an old book from the early 1900s. The very early 1900s. So it's about 100 years old. Old and over 100 years old by now. Canadian book from Lucy Maud Montgomery, who grew up in the area that the book is placed in, which is Avonlea in Prince Edward Island. So a lot of the locations being described here are real places. We've been reading this book for the past couple streams, so we're about a third of the way through the book now. Well, I guess we're halfway, but we will be a third of the way through the book once we, or 3/3 of the way through the book. Did I know math? Probably not. I don't know why I said a third of the book. I think I was thinking of the number 3 because we were 3/4 of the way there. Skeleton brain today, I guess. No thoughts, head empty. Interesting. Anyways, we're halfway through the book. It doesn't even matter because that's not even where we're at. We're halfway through. We're on chapter 20. Listen, this is cozy corner, not arithmetic corner. That's not comfy. Most of the time. Yeah, so we're about halfway through the book. We're on chapter 20. I can give you guys a summary, but we'll do that right before we start, so that it's all kind of connected. I've been enjoying this book. It's cozy, isosceles triangle. Yeah, I've been enjoying it quite a bit. I've read it quite some time ago, but a lot of that memory is faded. I only really remember like character names and a vague sense of events, but I don't remember much of the particulars. So this kind of feels like reading it again for the first time, which is quite nice because it's a really good book. The book seems nice, yeah. Yeah, it's very, very cozy and genuinely quite funny. Lucy Maud Montgomery has a funny sense of humor that she kind of slips in there. It's not a comedic book necessarily, but it is quite funny. What did you just get silenced for? Oh, you're mad about Canada? That's alright. Listen, the Canada described in this book no longer exists, let's be honest. So that's alright. Well, I mean, Green Gables does exist, but Canada in general. 10 weeks for a passport? Careful with those all caps. Getting into dangerous territory there. Nightbot might snipe you from the balcony. Then you'll get timed out for like 3 full minutes, and then you'll have to actually focus on your workout, huh? That'd be a shame. Alright. I think we've dawdled around enough. Let's get going. How can Nightbot snipe you from the balcony if you are the balcony? That is a good question. That is a good point. I didn't think of that. I used the word balcony probably just because I saw it in your name there. Nightbot is highly trained. Yeah, exactly. And I've given it a very very loose trigger finger too. And if it sees like even like a single sentence in all caps, it's ready to start blasting. But that's fine. I could have fixed it a long time ago, and I haven't. Because I think it's funny. It only takes me like 2 seconds to unban people who don't deserve it. So I think it's just funny when people get smited. All right. You excited to drink your chamomile after you make your calves the size of the sun? Fair enough. Fair enough. All right, let's get going. Let's get into the book. We seem to have been reading like 10 chapters per stream, um, which would which would kind of basically divide the book into quarters quite nicely. There's only 30 something chapters, but we'll play it by ear and we'll see where we get. We'll see how long these chapters are, because it's not quite 40, so we could do a little less this stream and still have it be pretty even. So let's see how long the chapters are, since they tend to vary quite wildly. Some are quite short, some are quite long. I think it just depends on how many uh and soliloquies there are in the chapter. If there's a couple, then it's a long chapter. If there's none, then it's a short chapter. But that's alright, we don't mind. We support Anne in her rambling. It would be hypocritical of me to condemn somebody for rambling pointlessly. Alright, let's take a look at where we left off. So we did kind of like the first 10 chapters in the first stream, and then we did the next 10 chapters after that. And so we've ended. We read chapter 20, and so we're right here. We're at a departure in a new departure in flavoring. That's where we left off. And so you can see we kind of have, we're about halfway through. So we'll see how far we get today. As for what's occurred so far, let's take a peek and let's do a little recap. Let's turn the music down a little bit. We had matcha boba today, and man, that grass is hitting. Let's see. All right, let's turn this down a tiny bit. Just a little quiet bird song in the background, just to give us a little bit of ambiance, so it's not just me and dead air. Okay, so to summarize for those who were not here in the past streams, this is Anne of Green Gables by Lucy Maud Montgomery. In case you couldn't tell by the big text above the screen. I can write it a couple more times if you can't tell. And so at the beginning of the book, two a brother and a sister who are kind of old, they're in their like late 50s, 60s. They've decided, after living on the farm way out in Avonlea, I can say the title. I missed it. This is Anne of Green Gables by L.M. Montgomery. This brother and sister have decided that they need help on the farm as they're getting older, and so they put in for an orphan from a nearby orphanage, I think in Nova Scotia, to adopt a boy to help on the farm. But as they find out when Matthew, the shy brother Matthew, rides into the train station that day to pick up the child. It'll be so real. You didn't know they were siblings? Yeah, they're siblings. Yeah, no, they're not married. They're siblings. I think it's only mentioned like once or twice at the beginning. It's not like brought up a ton, but yeah, they're brother and sister. They're not a couple. So at the as Matthew, the shy Matthew, rides in to the station to pick up the orphan boy that they've put in for to adopt, they find out that there was some sort of mistake somewhere along the way, through word of mouth and the paperwork, and so they've uh, they've learned that instead the orphanage sent them a young girl. Now that's not what they wanted, and they don't think that she'll be a lot of help on their farm. So Marilla does not want to keep this young orphan girl Anne. Um, but Matthew softens to her almost immediately as she talks on the ride back because he's too shy to tell her that he's got to send her away. And so he begins to empathize with her, and he convinces Marilla to let her stay for a little bit. And slowly, as Anne stays at Green Gables, which is their farm, Marilla softens on her as well, and actually begins to like the girl. As Anne has a very odd way of looking at the world. She's very imaginative. She describes things rather eloquently, and she is prone to going on long, rambling tangents where she switches topics quite rapidly. And so, as they go through their life, we've kind of gone through almost a part of a year now. We've gone through several seasons. We've gone through autumn and winter and spring. And so, as Anne stays there, she's been taught the ways of God. Marilla trying to bring her up properly, as she would put it. And so she's gone to Sunday school and voiced her opinion on that. She's been in all sorts of hijinks, which usually is caused by her speaking her mind when she maybe shouldn't be quite so honest. And she's been forced to apologize to several people for saying mean things. But she's befriended a young girl who lives in a farm nearby named Diana. And they've come become quite good friends. They are BFFs for sure. And she's begun going to school as well, in which she's formed a rivalry with a boy named Gilbert Blythe, uh, which seems to be a one sided rivalry. Anne quite despises the guy, um, for being so annoying, but he actually really likes her, um, and he's constantly congratulating her on doing well in school, and she's like, "Hell no, I gotta beat him next time." It's really adorable. We had an incident where one of the local kids was quite sick, and Anne helped out because she had helped raise multiple little children, both from her time at the orphanage and from some of the foster parents she'd been placed with. So she did have a bit of experience with quite young children. So she helped out, which helped quell some of the reluctance that her best friend Diana's mother had about her, who was convinced that she was a bad seed when she accidentally gave Diana wine instead of cordial and got Diana drunk accidentally. But where we left off, um, Diana and Anne had been allowed to hang out together, but Anne had been sent off to get something from Diana's house, and she had convinced herself that ghosts exist using her imagination. Um, and so she was too afraid to go into the woods out of fear of the banshees and stuff that live there. But she managed to get over there and get back in time, and that was kind of where we left off. Was her her talking endlessly about the ghosts that live in the haunted woods. So that's where we pick back up again. It's basically just been a lot of misadventure. This book is kind of cozy because it doesn't have like an antagonist necessarily. There's no like bad guy. trying to kidnap somebody or kill somebody. It's just like a bunch of misadventures all linked together. So let's get back into it. There's probably some funny things that I didn't describe for you that I missed out on. But that's all right. You can just go back and watch the other Vons. Oh, was that a moat? I was trying to figure out what balcony as a moat there was, because to me on my Streamlabs end, it just looked like a couple golf balls, and I was like, "What on earth is that?" And then I looked over in the other dashboard, and it's the saluting emote, and I was like, "Oh, okay, I see." I was like, "Why did you post 3 golf balls in a row?" But the other one makes a lot more sense. All right, let's get started. So let's get back to our chapter here. Yeah, see, she came back from the haunted woods, and Marilla was quite skeptical of these ghosts, trying to teach her a lesson basically by making her go into the haunted woods to teach her that ghosts aren't real. Uh, and we're not quite sure if Anne got the lesson. So let's get back into it. Let's get going. VOD watchers start here. Chapter 21: New Departure in Flavorings. Dear me, there is nothing but meetings and partings in this world, as Mrs. Lynde says, remarked Anne plaintively, putting her slate and books down on the kitchen table on the last day of June and wiping her red eyes with a very damp handkerchief. Wasn't it fortunate, Marilla, that I took an extra handkerchief to school today? I had a presentiment that it would be needed. I never thought you were so fond of Mr. Phillips that you would require 2 handkerchiefs to dry your tears just because he was going away, said Marilla. I don't think I was crying because I was really so very fond of him, reflected Anne. I just cried because all the others did. It was Ruby Gillis that started it. Ruby Gillis has always declared she hated Mr. Phillips, but just as soon as he got up to make his farewell speech, she burst into tears. Then all the girls began to cry, one after the other. I tried to hold out, Marilla. I tried to remember the time Mr. Phillips made me sit with a boy, and the time he spelled my name without an E on the blackboard, and how he said I was the worst dunce he ever saw at geometry, and laughed at my spelling, and all the times he had been so horrid and sarcastic. But somehow I couldn't, Marilla, and I just had to cry too. Jane Andrews has been talking for a month about how glad she'd be when Mr. Phillips went away, and she declared she'd never shed a tear. Well, she was worse than any of us, and had to borrow a handkerchief from her brother. Of course, the boys didn't cry, because she hadn't brought one of her own, not expecting to need it. Oh, Marilla, it was heartrending. Mr. Phillips made such a beautiful farewell speech beginning, "The time has come for us to part." It was very affecting. And he had tears in his eyes, too, Marilla. Oh, I felt dreadfully sorry and remorseful for all the times I talked to him. I talked in school and drawn pictures of him on my slate and made fun of him and Prissy. I can't tell you I wish I'd been a model pupil like Minnie Andrews. I can tell you I wished I'd been a model pupil like Minnie Andrews. She hadn't anything on her conscience. The girls cried all the way home from school. Carrie Sloane kept saying every few minutes, "The time has come for us to part." And that would start us off again whenever we were in danger of cheering out. I do feel dreadfully sad, Marilla. But one can't feel quite in the depths of despair with 2 months' vacation before them, can they, Marilla? And besides, we met the new minister and his wife coming from the station. For all I was feeling so bad about Mr. Phillips going away, I couldn't help taking a little interest in a new minister, could I? His wife is very pretty. Not exactly regally lovely, of course. It wouldn't do, I suppose, for a minister to have a regally lovely wife, because it might set a bad example. Mrs. Lynde says the minister's wife over at Newbridge sets a very bad example because she dresses so fashionably. Our new minister's wife was dressed in blue muslin with lovely puff sleeves and a hat trimmed with roses. Jane Andrews said she thought puff sleeves were too worldly for a minister's wife, but I didn't make any such uncharitable remark, Marilla, because I know what it is to long for puff sleeves. Besides, she's only been a minister's wife for a little while, so one should make allowances, shouldn't they? They are going to board with Mrs. Lynde until the manse is ready. If Marilla, in going down to Mrs. Lynde that evening, was actuated by any motive save her avowed one of returning the quilting frames she had borrowed the preceding winter, it was an amiable weakness shared by most of the Avonlea people. Many a thing Mrs. Lynde had lent, sometimes never expecting to see it again, came home that night in charge of the borrowers thereof. A new minister, and moreover a minister with a wife, was a lawful object of curiosity in a quiet little country settlement where sensations were few and far between. Old Mr. Bentley, the minister whom Anne had found lacking in imagination, had been pastor of Avonlea for 18 years. He was a widower when he came, and a widower he remained, despite the fact that gossip regularly married him to this, that, or the other one, every year of his sojourn. In the preceding February, he had resigned his charge and departed amid the regrets of his people, most of whom had the affection born of long intercourse for their good old minister in spite of his shortcomings as an orator. Since then, the Avonlea Church had enjoyed a variety of religious dissipation in listening to the many and various candidates and supplies who came Sunday after Sunday to preach on trial. These stood or fell by the judgment of the fathers and mothers in Israel. But a certain small red haired girl who sat meekly in the corner of the old Cuthbert pew also had her opinions about them and discussed the same in full with Matthew, Marilla always declining from principle to criticize ministers in any shape or form. I don't think Mr. Smith would have done, Matthew, was Anne's final summing up. Mrs. Lynde says his delivery was so poor, but I think his worst fault was just like Mr. Bentley. He had no imagination, and Mr. Terry had too much. He let it run away with him, just as I did mine in the matter of the haunted wood. Besides, Mrs. Lynde says his theology wasn't sound. Mr. Gresham was a very good man and a very religious man, but he told too many funny stories and made the people laugh in church. He was undignified. And you must have some dignity about a minister. Mustn't you, Matthew? I thought Mr. Marshall was decidedly attractive, but Mrs. Lynde says he isn't married or even engaged because she made special inquiries about him, and she says it would never do to have a young unmarried minister in Avonlea because he might marry in the congregation, and that would make trouble. Mrs. Lynde is a very far-seeing woman, isn't she, Matthew? I'm very glad they've called Mr. Allen. I liked him because his sermon was interesting, and he prayed as if he meant it, and not just as if he did it because he was in the habit of it. Mrs. Lynde says he isn't perfect, but she says she supposes we couldn't expect a perfect minister for $750 a year. And anyhow, his theology is sound because she questioned him thoroughly on all points of doctrine. And she knows his wife's people, and they are most respectable, and the women are all good housekeepers. Mrs. Lynde says that sound doctrine in the man and good housekeeping in the woman make an ideal combination for a minister's family. The new minister and his wife were a young, pleasant-faced couple, still on their honeymoon, and full of all good and beautiful enthusiasms for their chosen life work. Avonlea opened its heart to them from the start. Old and young liked the frank, cheerful young man with his high ideals, and the bright, gentle little lady who assumed the mistressship of the manse. With Mrs. Allen, Anne fell promptly and wholeheartedly in love. She had discovered another kindred spirit. With Mrs. Allen, Anne fell promptly and wholeheartedly in love. She had discovered another kindred spirit. Mrs. Allen is perfectly lovely, she announced on one Sunday afternoon. She's taken our class, and she's a splendid teacher. She said right away she didn't think it was fair for a teacher to ask all the questions. And you know, Marilla, that is exactly what I've always thought. She said we could ask her any question we liked, and I asked ever so many. I'm good at asking questions, Marilla. I believe you, was Marilla's emphatic comment. Nobody else asked any except Ruby Gillis, and she asked if there was to be a Sunday school picnic this summer. I didn't think that was a very proper question to ask, because it hadn't any connection with the lesson. The lesson was about Daniel in the lion's den, but Mrs. Allen just smiled, and she said she thought that There would be. Mrs. Allen has a lovely smile. She has exquisite dimples in her cheeks. I wish I had dimples in my cheeks, Marilla. I'm not half so skinny as I was when I came here, but I have no dimples yet. If I had, perhaps, I could influence people for good. Mrs. Allen said we ought to always try to influence other people for good. She talked so nice about everything. I never knew before that religion was such a cheerful thing. I always thought it was kind of melancholy, but Mrs. Allen's isn't. And I'd like to be a Christian if I could be one like her. I wouldn't want to be one like Mr. Superintendent Bell. It's very naughty of you to speak so about Mr. Bell, said Marilla severely. Mr. Bell is a real good man. Oh, of course he's good, agreed Anne, but he doesn't seem to get any comfort out of it. If I could be good, I'd dance and sing all day because I was glad of it. I suppose Mrs. Allen is too old to dance and sing, and of course it wouldn't be dignified in a minister's wife. But I can just feel she's glad she's a Christian, and she'd be one even if she could get to heaven without it. I suppose we must have Mr. and Mrs. Allen up to tea some day soon, said Marilla reflectively. They've been they've been most everywhere but here. Let me see. Next Wednesday would be a good time to have them. But don't say a word to Matthew about it, for if he knew they were coming, he'd find some excuse to be away that day. He got so used to Mr. Bentley he didn't mind him, but he's going to find it hard to get acquainted with a new minister, and a new minister's wife will frighten him to death. I'll be as secret as the dead, assured Anne. But oh, Marilla, will you let me make a cake for the occasion? I'd love to do something for Mrs. Allen, and you know I can make a pretty good cake by this time. You can make a layer cake, promised Marilla. Monday and Tuesday, great preparations went on at Green Gables. Having the minister and his wife to tea was a serious and important undertaking, and Marilla was determined not to be eclipsed by any of the Avonlea housekeepers. Anne was wild with excitement and delight. She talked it all over with Diana Tuesday night in the twilight, as they sat on the big red stones by the Dryad's bubble and made rainbows in the water with little twigs dipped in fir balsam. Everything is ready, Diana, except my cake, which I'm to make in the morning, and the baking powder biscuits, which Marilla will make just before tea time. I assure you, Diana, that Marilla and I have had a busy 2 days of it. It's such a responsibility having a minister's family to tea. I never went through such an experience before. You should just see our pantry. It's a sight to behold. We're going to have jellied chicken and cold tongue. We're to have 2 kinds of jelly, red and yellow, and whipped cream, and lemon pie, and cherry pie, and 3 kinds of cookies, and fruit cake, and Marilla's famous yellow plum preserves that she keeps especially for ministers, and pound cake, and layer cake, and biscuits as aforesaid, and a new bread and old both in case the minister is dyspeptic and can't eat new. Mrs. Lynde says ministers are dyspeptic, but I don't think Mr. Allen has been a minister long enough for it to have had a bad effect on him. I just grow cold when I think of my layer cake. Oh, Diana, what if it shouldn't be good? I dreamed last night that I was chased all around by a fearful goblin with a big layer cake for a head. It'll be good, all right, assured Diana, who was a very comfortable sort of friend. I'm sure that piece of the one you made that we had for lunch in Idlewild 2 weeks ago was perfectly elegant. Yes, but cakes have such a terrible habit of turning out bad, just especially when you want them to be good, sighed Anne, setting a particularly well balsamed twig afloat. However, I suppose I shall just have to trust Providence and be careful to put in the flour. Yeah, she did forget to put in the flour that one time. Oh, look, Diana, what a lovely rainbow. You suppose the Dryad will come out after we go away and take it for a scarf? You know, there is no such thing as a Dryad, said Diana. Diana's mother had found out about the haunted wood and had been decidedly angry over it. As a result, Diana had abstained from any further imitative flights of imagination, and did not think it prudent to cultivate a spirit of belief even in harmless Dryads. But it's so easy to imagine there is, said Anne. Every night before I go to bed, I look out of my window and wonder if the Dryad is really sitting here, combing her locks in the spring for a mirror, with the spring for a mirror. Sometimes I look for her footprints in the dew in the morning. Oh, Diana, don't you give up your faith in the Dryad. Wednesday morning came. Anne got up at sunrise because she was too excited to sleep. She had caught a severe cold in the head by reason of her dabbling in the spring on the preceding evening, but nothing short of absolute pneumonia would have quenched her interest in culinary matters that morning. After breakfast, she proceeded to make her cake. When she finally shut the oven door upon it, she drew a long breath. I'm sure I haven't forgotten anything this time, Marilla. But do you think it will rise? Just suppose perhaps the baking powder isn't good. I used it out of the new can, and Mrs. Lynde says you can never be sure of getting good baking powder nowadays when everything is so adulterated. Mrs. Lynde says the government ought to take the matter up, but she says we'll never see the day when a Tory government will do it. Marilla, what if the cake doesn't rise? We'll have plenty without it, was Marilla's unimpassioned way of looking at the subject. The cake did rise, however, and came out of the oven as light and feathery as golden foam. Anne, flushed with delight, clapped it together with layers of ruby jelly and, in imagination, saw Mrs. Allen eating it and possibly asking for another piece. You'll be using the best tea set, of course, Marilla, she said. Can I fix the table with ferns and wild roses? I think that's all nonsense, sniffed Marilla. In my opinion, it's the eatables that matter, not flummery decoration. Mrs. Barry had her table decorated, said Anne, who was not entirely guiltless of the wisdom of the serpent. And the minister paid her an elegant compliment. He said it was a feast for the eye as well as the palate. Well, do as you like, said Marilla, who was quite determined not to be surpassed by Mrs. Barry or anybody else. Only mind you leave enough room for the dishes and the food. Anne laid herself out to decorate in a manner and after a fashion that should leave Mrs. Barry's nowhere. Having abundance of roses and ferns and a very artistic taste of her own, she made that tea table such a thing of beauty that when the minister and his wife sat down to it, they exclaimed in chorus over its loveliness. It's Anne's doing, said Marilla, grimly just, and Anne felt that Mrs. Allen's approving smile was almost too much happiness for this world. Matthew was there, having been inveigled into the party, only goodness and Anne knew how. He had been in such a state of shyness and nervousness that Marilla had given him up in despair. But Anne took him in hand so successfully that he now sat at the table in his best clothes and white collar, and talked to the minister not uninterestingly. He never said a word to Mrs. Allen, but that perhaps was not to be expected. All went merry as a marriage bell until Anne's layer cake was packed. Mrs. Allen, having already been helped to a bewildering variety, declined it. But Marilla, seeing the disappointment on Anne's face, said smilingly, Oh, you must take a piece of this, Mrs. Allen. Anne made it on purpose for you. In that case, I must sample it, laughed Mrs. Allen, helping herself to a plump triangle, as did also the minister and Marilla. Mrs. Allen took a mouthful of hers, and a most peculiar expression crossed her face. Not a word did she say, however, but steadily ate away at it. Marilla saw the expression and hastened to taste the cake. Anne Shirley, she exclaimed, what on earth did you put into that cake? Nothing but what the recipe said, Marilla, cried Anne with a look of anguish. Oh, isn't it all right? All right? It's simply horrible. Mr. Allen, don't try to eat it. Anne, taste it yourself. What flavoring did you use? Vanilla, said Anne, her face scarlet with mortification after tasting the cake. Only vanilla? Oh, Marilla, it must have been the baking powder. I had my suspicions of that baking powder fiddlesticks. Go and bring me the bottle of vanilla you used. Anne fled to the pantry and returned with a small bottle partially filled with a brown liquid and labeled yellowly, Best Vanilla. Marilla took it, uncorked it, smelled it. Yeah, classic Anne. This is a classic Anne moment. Mercy on us, Anne. You flavored that cake with anodyne liniment. I broke the liniment bottle last week and poured what was left into an old empty vanilla bottle. I suppose it's partly my fault. I should have warned you. But for pity's sake, why couldn't you have smelled it? Anne dissolved into tears under this double disgrace. I couldn't. I had such a cold. And with this, she fairly fled to the gable chamber, where she cast herself on the bed and wept as one who refuses to be comforted. Presently, a light step sounded on the stairs, and somebody entered the room. Oh, Marilla, sobbed Anne, without looking up. I'm disgraced forever. I shall never be able to live this down. It will get out. Things always do get out in Avonlea. Diana will ask me how my cake turned out, and I shall have to tell her the truth. I shall always be pointed at as the girl who flavored a cake with anodyne liniment. Gil, the boys in school, will never get over laughing at it. Oh, Marilla, if you have a spark of Christian pity, don't tell me that I must go down and wash the dishes after this. I'll wash them when the minister and his wife are gone, but I cannot ever look Mrs. Allen in the face again. Perhaps she'll think I tried to poison her. Mrs. Lynde says she knows an orphan girl who tried to poison her benefactor. But the liniment isn't poisonous. It's meant to be taken internally, although not in cakes. Won't you tell Mrs. Allen so, Marilla? Suppose you jump up and tell her so yourself, said a merry voice. Anne flew up to find Mrs. Allen standing by her bed, surveying her with laughing eyes. My dear little girl, you mustn't cry like this, she said, genuinely disturbed by Anne's tragic face. Why, it's all just a funny mistake that anybody might make. Oh no, it takes me to make such a mistake, said Anne forlornly. And I wanted to have that cake so nice for you, Mrs. Allen. Yes, I know, dear. And I assure you I appreciate your kindness and thoughtfulness just as much as if it had turned out all right. Now you mustn't cry any more, but come down with me and show me your flower garden. Miss Cuthbert tells me you have a little plot all your own. I want to see it, for I am very much interested in flowers. Anne permitted herself to be led down and comforted, reflecting that it was really providential that Mrs. Allen was a kindred spirit. Nothing more was said about the liniment cake, and when the guests went away, Anne found that she had enjoyed the evening more than could have ever been expected, considering that terrible incident. Nevertheless, she sighed deeply. Marilla, isn't it nice to think that tomorrow is a new day with no mistakes in it yet? I'll warrant you'll make plenty in it, said Marilla. I never saw your beat for making mistakes, Anne. I never saw your beat for making mistakes, Anne. Oh, I said that right. I thought I said it wrong. Yes, and well, I know it, admitted Anne mournfully. But have you ever noticed one encouraging thing about me, Marilla? I never make the same mistake twice. I don't know as that's much benefit when you're always making new ones. But don't you see, Marilla, there must be a limit to the mistakes one person can make. And when I get to the end of them, I'll be through with them. That's a very comforting thought. Well, you better go and give that cake to the pigs, said Marilla. It isn't fit for any human to eat, not even Jerry Boot. Is that their, is that their helper guy that they hire? I forget. I think that's him, right? End of chapter. I like the, I like the cake goblin that she describes being chased around by. In her dream. I like that she talks about goblins a lot, doesn't she? Truly a kindred spirit. Quite the chapter, yeah. She does seem to mix things up quite a lot. Liniment cake, huh? That would not be that would not be very good. That one was a little bit on Marilla, though, for real. Like an anodyne is like a pain killer. I'm not particularly sure what Montgomery is referring to here, Because I don't know, when I think of liniments, I think a lot of like they're used as like rubs more so than taken internally. But she describes it as taken internally there. So maybe anodyne liniment is something specific, but not exactly sure. Um, but it certainly wouldn't taste good. Basically, she gave her medicine. It's like dumping a whole bottle of like I don't know Buckley's into a cake or something. Trying to flavor your cake with cough syrup or something like that. It wouldn't taste good instead of vanilla extract. Lean cake? No, not quite that. Anne really does poison people a lot, huh? It's especially funny because of Mrs. Lind at the beginning when Marilla's like, "Yeah, we're gonna get an orphan. We're gonna adopt an orphan from the nearby orphanage," and Mrs. Lind is like, "Oh no, you can't do that. You have no idea how some of these children are crazy. I heard a story about a girl who who poisoned the well at the family that took her in, and and now look at us. Look at us now. Mrs. Lind correct the whole entire time." It adds a sense of comedy to it. It's really funny. That entire like setup with Mrs. Lind is genuinely quite funny in retrospect. It was funny back then too. No, the chapter itself was funny. Mrs. Lind describing all these horrible things that orphans have done just to try to dissuade them from getting one. While they already have one on the way. That was already funny, but the retrospective and accidentally doing all the things that Mrs. Lynn described is really funny. All we need is for her to burn down some building and we're there. But yeah, that was that was a funny chapter. It's classic Anne moment for real. Anne commits arson. It would be an accident. It would be an accident, and it would be half Murillo's fault. Um, if that happened, that's how it would go down. Murillo has been half at fault for like all of Anne's mistakes so far, which I think is actually quite nice because um it provides a lot of character growth for Marilla too. Like even though Anne is clearly the main character, we actually mostly see the Marilla and Anne interactions from more so Marilla's perspective a lot of the time. We get a lot of her internal thoughts and not Anne's internal thoughts whenever it's the two of them talking, which I actually think is quite nice because like we get a lot of Anne character development, but it because we see so many other things through Marilla's perspective, she grows a lot too, and almost feels like a main character in and of herself. Like it feels like either of them could be protagonist almost. Marilla hands a box of matches and goes, "Yeah, it's just an empty box." Or she goes like, "Yeah, I put the I put a bunch of buttons in there because it was an empty box." And then, no, not that empty box, Anne. Marilla would be like, "Oh, yeah, can you toss some more kindling onto the stove there? I don't worry about the box label. I know it says like gasoline, but it's just because all the gasoline was gone, and I put the spare kindling in the gasoline box. Don't worry about that. Just toss it in there." That's what Marilla would do. All right, let's keep going. But I like that Marilla's mistakes affect Anne, and that she kind of has to own up to it. It makes them have to like meet in the middle a lot, which is nice. It's not just like Marilla condescending to Anne. Most of the time that Anne's making mistakes, it's making her realize like faults of her own, which is um which is nice. It's like it makes it feel like authentic parenting. A lot of parenting seems to be like trying to help children avoid your own faults, if that makes sense. Let's move on. Let's get to the next chapter. Man, it's already been an hour. We only read one chapter. That was a longer one. I did also talk a lot at the beginning. All right, let's get going. Chapter 22. Anne is invited out to tea. And what are your eyes popping out of your head about now? Asked Marilla, when Anne had just come in from a run to the post office. Have you discovered another kindred spirit? Excitement hung around Anne like a garment, shone in her eyes, kindled in every feature. She'd come dancing up the lane like a wind-blown sprite, though through the mellow sunshine and lazy shadows of the August evening. No, Marilla, but oh, what do you think? I am invited to tea at the manse tomorrow afternoon. Mrs. Allen left a letter for me at the post office. Just look at it, Marilla. Miss Anne Shirley, Green Gables. That's the first time I was ever called Miss. Such a thrill as it gave me. I shall cherish it forever amongst my choicest treasure. Mrs. Allen told me she meant to have all the members of her Sunday school class to tea in turn, said Marilla, regarding the wonderful event very coolly. You needn't get in such a fever over it. Do learn to take things calmly, child. Not gonna happen with it. For Anne to take things calmly would have been to change her nature. Yeah, exactly. All spirit and fire and dew as she was, the pleasures and pains of life came to her with trebled intensity. Marilla felt this and was vaguely troubled over it, realizing that the ups and downs of existence would probably bear hardly on this impulsive soul, and not sufficiently understanding that the equally great capacity for delight might more than compensate. Therefore, Marilla conceived of it to be her duty to drill Anne into a tranquil uniformity of disposition, as impossible and alien to her as to a dancing sunbeam in one of the brook shallows. She did not make much headway, as she sorrowfully admitted to herself. The downfall of some dear hope or plan plunged Anne into deeps of affliction. The fulfillment thereof exalted her to dizzy realms of delight. Marilla had almost begun to despair of ever fashioning this waif of the world into her model little girl of demure manners and prim deportment. Neither would she have believed that she really liked Anne much better as she was. Anne went to bed that night speechless with misery, because Matthew had said the wind was round northeast and he feared it would be a rainy day tomorrow. The rustle of the poplar leaves about the house worried her. It sounded so like pattering raindrops, and the full faraway roar of the Gulf, to which she listened delightedly at other times, loving its strange, sonorous, haunting rhythm, now seemed like the prophecy of storm and disaster to a small maiden who particularly wanted a fine day. Anne thought that the morning would never come, but all things have an end, even nights before the day on which you are invited to take tea at the manse. The morning, in spite of Matthew's predictions, was fine, and Anne's spirits soared to their highest. Oh, Marilla, there is something in me today that makes me just love everybody I see, she exclaimed as she washed the breakfast dishes. You don't know how good I feel. Wouldn't it be nice if it could last? I believe I could be a model child if I were just invited out to tea every day. But oh, Marilla, it's a solemn occasion, too. I feel so anxious. What if I shouldn't behave properly? You know, I never had tea at a manse before, and I'm not sure that I know all the rules of etiquette, although I've been studying the rules given in the etiquette department of the Family Herald ever since I came here. I'm so afraid I'll do something silly or forget to do something I should do. Would it be good manners to take a second helping of anything if you wanted to very much? The trouble with you, Anne, is that you're thinking too much about yourself. You should just think of Mrs. Allen and what would be nicest and most agreeable to her, said Marilla, hitting for once in her life on a very sound and pithy piece of advice. Anne instantly realized this. You're right, Marilla. I'll try not to think about myself at all. and evidently got through her visit without any serious breach of etiquette, for she came home through the twilight under a great high-sprung sky gloried over with trails of saffron and rosy cloud, in a beatified state of mind, and told Marilla all about it happily, sitting on the big red sandstone slab at the kitchen door, with her tired curly head in Marilla's gingham lap. A cool wind was blowing down over the long harvest fields from the rims of furry western hills, and whistled through the poplars. One clear star hung over the orchard, and the fireflies were flitting over in Lover's Lane, in and out among the ferns and rustling boughs. Anne watched them as she talked and somehow felt that wind and stars and fireflies were all tangled up together in something unutterably sweet and enchanting. Oh, Marilla, I've had a most fascinating time. I feel that I have not lived in vain, and I shall always feel like that, even if I should never be invited to tea at the manse again. When I got there, Mrs. Allen met me at the door. She was dressed in the sweetest dress of pale pink organdy, with dozens of frills and elbow sleeves, and she looked just like a seraph. I really think I'd like to be a minister's wife when I grow up, Marilla. A minister mightn't mind my red hair because he wouldn't be thinking of such worldly things. But then, of course, one would have to be naturally good, and I'll never be that. So I suppose there's no use in thinking about it. Some people are naturally good, and others are not. I'm one of the others. Mrs. Lynde says I'm full of original sin. No matter how hard I try to be good, I can never make such a success of it as those who are naturally good. It's a good deal like geometry, I expect. But don't you think that the trying so hard ought to count for something? Mrs. Allen is one of the naturally good people. I love her passionately. There are some people, like Matthew and Mrs. Allen, that you can love right off without any trouble. And there are others, like Mrs. Lynde, that you have to try very hard to love. You ought to love them because they know so much and are such active workers in the church, but you have to keep reminding yourself of it all the time, or else you forget. There was another little girl at the manse to tea, from the White Sands Sunday School. Her name was Lorette Bradley, and she was a very nice little girl, not exactly a kindred spirit, but still very nice. We had an elegant tea, and I think I kept all the rules of etiquette pretty well. After tea, Mrs. Allen played and sang, and she got Loretta and me to sing too. Mrs. Allen says I have a good voice, and she says I must sing in the Sunday school choir after this. Can't think how I was thrilled at the mere thought. I've longed, I've longed so to sing in the Sunday school choir, as Diana does, but I feared it was an honor I could never aspire to. Loretta had to go home early because there is a big concert in the White Sands Hotel tonight, and her sister is to recite at it. Loretta says that the Americans at the hotel give a concert every fortnight in aid of the Charlottetown Hospital, and they ask lots of the White Sands people to recite. Loretta said she expected to be asked herself someday. I just gazed at her in awe. After she had gone, Mrs. Allen and I had a heart-to-heart talk. I told her everything about Mrs. Thomas and the twins and Katie Maurice and Violetta and coming to Green Gables and my troubles over geometry. And would you believe it, Marilla? Mrs. Allen told me she was a dunce at geometry too. You don't know how that encouraged me. Mrs. Lynde came to the manse just before I left. And what do you think, Marilla? The trustees have hired a new teacher, and it's a lady. Her name is Miss Muriel Stacy. Isn't that a romantic name? Mrs. Lynde says they've never had a female teacher in Avonlea before, and she thinks it is a dangerous innovation. But I think it would be splendid to have a lady teacher, and I really don't see how I'm going to live through the next 2 weeks before school begins. I'm so impatient to see her. End of chapter. That was a shorter one. The first one was quite long, but that was a lot shorter. That one only took us a couple minutes. Whenever it's just Anne talking in the chapter, it always goes by faster because she talks. So it was good though. I think most of this chapter was just Anne describing the dinner, wasn't it? Yeah, just going to tea. Thank you for the follow. Um, damn, I always do the thing where I'm trying to separate out the names. They're like all one word, right? Twitch names, and so I'm trying to separate it out into Which part of the name is which? uh, jaw all flowery. It could be that. It could be Jawal flower e, but the YT could be a different part of it. But thank you regardless. Flowery. I'm sorry that I'm butchering you. I really do appreciate you following me. You can just type in chat and tell me how to say it. Then I won't pathetically um fumble around with your name uh like a right bastard. Oh, the follower goal was met as well. Thank you. Thank you for meeting our follower goal then, especially. That's awfully kind of you. And thank you for stopping by. Bro, did you hear about Discord changing their name system? I did hear about that. They're doing it in like batches or something, depending on like I don't know how old your account is or something like that. Gotta snatch Charlemagne before somebody else does. I don't know. I don't know if I'm getting it. I don't think there's anything wrong with how it works right now. I think it's perfectly fine how it works right now. It's one of those examples of reinventing the wheel and fixing what isn't broken. What did you get silenced for? You have to start going by your Twitter handle. Well, they're keeping like the nickname system, right? That's gonna be kept. So like, even if you don't get the exact username you want, you can still have your name look normal, right? In actual servers, hopefully. Whatever. It doesn't matter right now. Let's go to the next chapter. I think in my hurry to steep my tea for the stream, I think I scalded it. It's a little bitter. I think I might have scalded the tea leaves. Oh well. It's not undrinkable. It's just a little too bitter. I was just so excited to get here and read with you guys. Listen, Anne would scald her tea leaf. Okay, so I'm not alone here. And now you feel about good. Good. You should. Thank you. All right. Chapter 23. Anne comes to grief in an affair of honor. She's gonna have a duel. Her honor's been offended. She's gonna duel somebody. Chapter 23. Anne comes to grief in an affair of honor. Anne had to live through more than 2 weeks, as it happened. Almost a month having elapsed since the liniment cake episode, it was high time for her to get into fresh trouble of some sort. Little mistakes, such as absent mindedly emptying a pan of skim milk into a basket of yarn balls in the pantry instead of into the pig's bucket, and walking clean over the edge of the log bridge into the brook while wrapped in imaginative reverie, not really being worth counting. A week after the tea at the manse, Diana Barry gave a party. Small and select, Anne assured Marilla. Just the girls in our class. They had a very good time and nothing untoward happened until after tea, when they found themselves in the berry garden, a little tired of all their games and ripe for any enticing form of mischief which might present itself. This presently took the form of daring. Daring was the fashionable amusement among the Avonlea small fry just then. It had begun amongst the boys, but soon spread to the girls, and all the silly little things that were done in Avonlea that summer because the doers thereof were dared to do them, would fill a book by themselves. First of all, Carrie Sloane dared Ruby Gillis to climb to a certain point in the huge old willow tree before the front door, which Ruby Gillis, albeit in mortal dread of the fat green caterpillars with which said tree was infested, and with fear of her mother before her eyes, if she should tear her new muslin dress, nimbly did, to the discomfiture of the aforesaid Carrie Sloane. Then Josie Pye dared Jane Andrews to hop on her left leg around the garden without stopping once, or putting her right foot to the ground, which Jane Andrews gamely tried to do, but gave out at the third corner and had to confess herself defeated. Josie's triumph being rather more pronounced than good taste permitted, Anne Shirley dared her to walk along the top of the board fence which bounded the garden to the east. Now, to walk board fences requires more skill and steadiness of head and heel than one might suppose who has never tried it. But Josie Pye, if deficient in some qualities that make for popularity, had at least a natural and inborn gift duly cultivated for walking board fences. Josie walked the berry fence with an airy unconcern which seemed to imply that a little thing like that wasn't worth a dare. Reluctant admiration greeted her exploit, for most of the other girls could appreciate it, having suffered many things themselves in their efforts to walk fences. Josie descended from her perch, flushed with victory, and darted a defiant glance at Anne. Anne tossed her red braids. I don't think it's such a very wonderful thing to walk a little low board fence, she said. I knew a girl in Marysville who could walk the ridgepole of a roof. I don't believe it, said Josie flatly. I don't believe anybody could walk a ridgepole. You couldn't, anyhow. Couldn't I? Cried Anne rashly. Then I dare you to do it, said Josie defiantly. I dare you to climb up there and walk the ridgepole of Mr. Barry's kitchen roof. Anne turned pale, but there was clearly only one thing to be done. She walked toward the house, where a ladder was leaning against the kitchen roof. All the fifth-class girls said, "Oh," partly in excitement, partly in dismay. Don't you do it, Anne, entreated Diana. You'll fall off and be killed. Never mind, Josie Pye. It isn't fair to dare anybody to do anything so dangerous. I must do it. My honor is at stake, said Anne solemnly. I shall walk that ridgepole, Diana, or perish in the attempt. If I am killed, you are to have my pearl bead ring. Anne climbed the ladder amid breathless silence, gained the ridgepole, balanced herself uprightly on that precarious footing, and started to walk along it, dizzily conscious that she was uncomfortably high up in the world, and that walking ridgepoles was not a thing in which your imagination helped you out very much. Nevertheless, she managed to take several steps before the catastrophe came. Then she swayed, lost her balance, stumbled, staggered, and fell, sliding down over the sun-baked roof and crashing off it through the tangle of Virginia creeper beneath, all before the dismayed circle below could give a simultaneous, terrified shriek. If Anne had tumbled off the roof on the side up which she had ascended, Diana would probably have fallen heir to the pearl bead ring then and there. Fortunately, she fell on the other side, where the roof extended down over the porch so nearly to the ground that a fall therefrom was a much less serious thing. Nevertheless, when Diana and the other girls had rushed frantically around the house, except Ruby Gillis, who remained as if rooted to the ground and went into hysterics, they found Anne lying all white and limp among the wreck and ruin of the Virginia creeper. Anne, are you killed? Shrieked Diana, throwing herself on her knees beside her friend. Oh, Anne, dear Anne, speak just one word to me and tell me if you're killed. To the immense relief of all the girls, and especially of Josie Pye, who, in spite of a lack of imagination, had been seized with horrible visions of a future branded as the girl who was the cause of Anne Shirley's early and tragic death, Anne sat dizzily up and answered uncertainly, No, Diana, I am not killed, but I think I am rendered unconscious. Where? sobbed Carrie Sloane. Oh, where, Anne? Before Anne could answer, Mrs. Barry appeared on the scene. At sight of her, Anne tried to scramble to her feet, but sank back again with a sharp little cry of pain. What's the matter? Have you hurt yourself? Demanded Mrs. Barry. My ankle, gasped Anne. Oh, Diana, please find your father and ask him to take me home. I know I can never walk there, and I'm sure I couldn't hop so far on one foot when Jane couldn't even hop around the garden. Verla was out in the orchard, picking a panful of summer apples, When she saw Mr. Barry coming over the log bridge and up the slope, with Mrs. Barry beside him and a whole procession of little girls trailing after him. In his arms he carried Anne, whose head lay limply against his shoulder. At that moment, Marilla had a revelation. In the sudden stab of fear that pierced her very heart, she realized what Anne had come to mean to her. She would have admitted that she liked Anne, nay, that she was very fond of Anne, but now she knew as she hurried wildly down the slope that Anne was dearer to her than anything else on earth. Mr. Barry, what has happened to her? She gasped, more white and shaken than the self contained, sensible Marilla had been for many years. Anne herself answered, lifting her head. Don't be very frightened, Marilla. I was walking the ridgepole and I fell off. I expect I have sprained my ankle, but Marilla, I might have broken my neck. Let us look on the bright side of things. So this chapter's hilarious. I might have known you'd go and do something of the sort when I let you go to that party, said Marilla, sharp and shrewish in her very relief. Bring her in here, Mr. Barry, and lay her on the sofa. Mercy me, the child has gone and fainted. It was quite true. Overcome by the pain of her injury, Anne had one more of her wishes granted to her. She had fainted dead away. Matthew, hastily summoned from the harvest field, was straightway dispatched for the doctor, who in due time came to discover that the injury was more serious than they had supposed. Anne's ankle was broken. That night, when Marilla went up to the east gable, where a white-faced girl was lying, a plaintive voice greeted her from the bed. Aren't you very sorry for me, Marilla? It was your own fault, said Marilla, twitching down the blind and lighting a lamp. And that is just why you should be sorry for me, said Anne, because the thought that is all my fault is what makes it so hard. If I could blame it on anybody, I would feel so much better. But what would you have done, Marilla, if you had been dared to walk the ridgepole? I'd have stayed on good firm ground and let them dare away. Such absurdity, said Marilla. Anne sighed. But you have such strength of mind, Marilla. I haven't. I just felt that I couldn't bear Josie Pye's scorn. She would have crowed over me all my life. And I think I have been punished so much that you needn't be very cross with me, Marilla. It's not a bit nice to faint after all. And the doctor hurt me dreadfully when he was setting my ankle. I won't be able to go around for 6 or 7 weeks, and I'll miss the new lady teacher. She won't be new anymore by the time I'm able to go to school. And Gil, everybody will get ahead of me in class. Oh, I am an afflicted mortal. But I'll try to bear it all bravely if only you won't be cross with me, Marilla. There, I'm not cross, said Marilla. You're an unlucky child, there's no doubt about that. But as you say, you'll have the suffering of it. Here now, try and eat some supper. Isn't it fortunate I've got such an imagination? Said Anne. It will help me through splendidly, I expect. What do people who haven't any imagination do when they break their bones, do you suppose, Marilla? Anne had good reason to bless her imagination many a time and oft during the tedious 7 weeks that followed. But she was not solely dependent on it. She had many visitors, and not a day passed without one or more of the schoolgirls dropping in to bring her flowers and books and tell her all the happenings in the juvenile world of Avonlea. Everybody has been so good and kind, Marilla, sighed Anne happily, on the day when she could first limp across the floor. It isn't very pleasant to be laid up, but there is a bright side to it, Marilla. You find out how many friends you have. Why, even Superintendent Bell came to see me, and he's really a very fine man. Not a kindred spirit, of course, but I still like him, and I'm awfully sorry I ever criticized his prayers. I believe now he really does mean them, only he has got into the habit of saying them as if he didn't. He'd get over that if he'd take a little trouble. I gave him a good broad hint. I told him how hard I tried to make my own little private prayers interesting. He told me all about the time he broke his ankle when he was a boy. It does seem so strange to think of Superintendent Bell ever being a boy. Even my imagination has its limits, for I can't imagine that. When I try to imagine him as a boy, I see him with grey whiskers and spectacles, just as he looks in Sunday school, only small. Now, it's so easy to imagine Mrs. Allen as a little girl. Mrs. Allen has been to see me 14 times. Isn't that something to be proud of, Marilla? When a minister's wife has so many claims on her time, and is such a cheerful person to have visit you as well. She never tells you it's your own fault and she hopes you'll be a better girl on account of it. Mrs. Lynn always told me that when she came to see me, and she said it in a kind of way that made me feel she might hope I'd be a better girl, but didn't really believe I would. Even Josie Pye came to see me. I received her as politely as I could, because I think she was sorry she dared me to walk a ridgepole. If I had been killed, she would have had to carry a dark burden of remorse all her life. Diana has been a faithful friend. She's been glad over every day to cheer my lonely pillow. She's been over every day to cheer my lonely pillow. But oh, I shall be so glad when I can go to school, for I've heard such exciting things about the new teacher. The girls all think she is perfectly sweet. Diana says she has the loveliest fair curly hair and such fascinating eyes. She dresses beautifully, and her sleeve puffs are bigger than anybody else's in Avonlea. Every other Friday afternoon she has recitations, and everybody has to say a piece or take a part in the dialogue. Oh, it's just glorious to think of it. Josie Pye says she hates it, but that is just because Josie has so little imagination. Diana and Ruby Gillis and Jane Andrews are preparing a dialogue called A Morning Visit for next Friday, and the Friday afternoons they don't have recitations. Miss Stacy takes them all to the woods for a field day, and they study ferns and flowers and birds, and they have physical culture exercises going every morning and evening. Mrs. Lynde says she's never heard of such goings on, and it all comes to having a lady teacher. But I think it must be splendid, and I believe I shall find Miss Stacy is a kindred spirit. There's only one thing plain to be seen, Anne, said Marilla, and that is that your fall off the berry roof hasn't injured your tongue at all. End of chapter. That was a really funny chapter. The entire sequence of her falling off the roof is really funny. I was trying my best not to just laugh while I was reading it because you wouldn't be able to understand me. But it was really funny. The way that she phrases everything. Yeah, and please tell me if you're dead. And then Anne's like, no. No, I'm just unconscious. And then the other girl's like, unconscious where? Tell me where. Where? Yeah, the entire sequence is really funny. Oh, it also harkens back to like the chapter itself mentions it, but Anne before was waxing poetic about how romantic it is to faint, and that she wishes she could faint, like a lady of old. Um, and so she was granted her wish. I like that all of her little setups come back to haunt her in little ways. All the things she deems romantic end up being a little bit more realistic for her taste. Um, it's uh, it's good foreshadowing. Quite lovely. Yeah, that chapter was really funny. I enjoyed it immensely. And yeah, you're right. Scrolling back up in chat as I was reading, but that little mom moment from Marilla, that character development, was really nice. And then and just being like, well, look on the bright side though. I could have been dead. It's really funny. Just immediately trying to not get people to be mad at her. It's like, hang on, don't be mad at me. Look on the bright side. I could have broken my neck. That's her first place she goes to is really funny. Um, what's I gonna say? I was gonna say something else. It's funny also that it was basically it was partly her own fault, right? Um, I like that there's always that kind of trend to her bad luck and her little mistakes and stuff that she makes. They are usually slightly her fault at some point, you know? Like she's never perfectly innocent in any of them. Like she was dared to walk the ridgepole because she was trying to grandstand about Oh, well, what you did isn't so impressive. Like that's the only reason the ridgepole thing even came up. Like she brought it up. So like it was her own fault. Yeah, see here. It's like, oh, it's not special. Anybody could do that. I knew a girl who walked the ridgepole, and then that's when they dared her to do it. Like her own her own hubris always gets her. Her own rashness. I think my parents think I'm insane because I'm sat here laughing to myself in silence like a maniac. Fair enough. Your parents know that headphones exist, though, right? If y'all don't go to the Baron's mansion next session, I quit. This map is insane. Well, I mean, now that you tell me that, I can make them go. I will convince them. I think that's the direction we were headed anyway. We do have to do that meeting though. MSQ misery, yeah, exactly. Misery's main magic power is that she can see the little exclamation mark symbol over everybody's head. Parents know headphones exist, but they won't use them. Fair enough. How would you just get timed out for? Oh, not timed out, just silent. They listen to things at full volume. Fair enough. Hey, none of that. That's not cozy. None of that non-cozy sentiment. You must love your family in spite of their flaws. No uncozy sentiments allowed. Good, better. All right, let's continue. uh, hang on. Sorry, my brain rot almost tried to pronounce that chapter 2014. The Final Fantasy 14 brain rot has set in, waiting for the next patch, and I almost said 2014 because I was like, we're in the 20s of the chapters, and then I saw XIV and it's like, that's 14. I know that one. Brain rot. Okay. Chapter 24. Chapter 24. That's what it is. 2024. Everybody. Chapter 24. Miss Stacy and her pupils get up a concert. It was October again when Anne was ready to go back to school. A glorious October, all red and gold, with mellow mornings when the valleys were filled with delicate mists as if the spirit of autumn had poured them in for the sun to drain. Amethyst, pearl, silver, rose, and smoke blue. The dews were so heavy that the fields glistened like a cloth of silver, and there were such heaps of rustling leaves in the hollows of many stemmed woods to run crisply through. The birch path was a canopy of yellow, and the ferns were sere and brown all along it. There was a tang in the very air that inspired the hearts of small maidens tripping, unlike snails, swiftly and willingly to school. And it was jolly to be back again at the little brown desk beside Diana, with Ruby Gillis nodding across the aisle, and Carrie Sloane sending up notes, and Julia Bell passing a chew of gum down from the back seat. Anne drew a long breath of happiness as she sharpened her pencil and arranged her picture cards in her desk. Life was certainly very interesting. In the new teacher, she found another true and helpful friend. Miss Stacy was a bright, sympathetic young woman with the happy gift of winning and holding the affections of her pupils, and bringing out the best that was in them mentally and morally. Anne expanded like a flower under this wholesome influence, and carried home to the admiring Matthew and the critical Marilla glowing accounts of schoolwork and aims. I love Miss Stacy with my whole heart, Marilla. She is so ladylike, and she has such a sweet voice. When she pronounces my name, I feel instinctively that she's spelling it with an E. We had recitations this afternoon. I just wish you could have been there to hear me recite Mary Queen of Scots. I just put my whole soul into it. Ruby Gillis told me coming home that the way I said the line, "Now from my father's arm," she said, "My woman's heart farewell," just made her blood run cold. Well, now, you might recite it for me some of these days, out in the barn, suggested Matthew. I should have known it was Matthew. Of course I will, said Anne meditatively. But I won't be able to do it so well, I know. It won't be as exciting as it is when you have a whole schoolful before you, hanging breathlessly on your words. I know I won't be able to make your blood run cold. Mrs. Lynde said it made her blood run cold to see the boys climbing to the very tops of those big trees on Bell's Hill after crows' nests last Friday, said Marilla. I wonder at Miss Stacy for encouraging it. But we wanted a crow's nest for nature study, explained Anne. That was on our field afternoon. Field afternoons are splendid, Marilla, and Miss Stacy explains everything so beautifully. We have to write compositions on our field afternoons, and I write the best ones. It's very vain of you to say so, then. You'd better let your teacher say it. But she did say it, Marilla, and indeed I'm not vain about it. How can I be when I'm such a dunce at geometry? Although I'm really beginning to see through it a little, too. Miss Stacy makes it so clear. Still, I'll never be good at it, and I assure you it is a humbling reflection. But I love writing composition. Mostly Miss Stacy lets us choose our own subject. But next week we are to write a composition on some remarkable person. It's hard to choose among so many remarkable people who who have, who have lived. Mustn't it be splendid to be remarkable and have compositions written about you after you're dead? Oh, I would dearly love to be remarkable. I think when I grow up I'll be a trained nurse and go with the Red Crosses to the field of battle as a messenger of mercy. That is, if I don't go out as a foreign missionary. That would be very romantic, but one would have to be very good to be a missionary, and that would be a stumbling block. We have physical culture exercises every day, too. They make you graceful and promote digestion. Promote fiddlesticks, said Marilla, who honestly thought it was all nonsense. But all the field afternoons and recitation Fridays and physical culture contortions paled before a project which Miss Stacy brought forward in November. This was that the scholars of Avonlea School should get up a concert and hold it in the hall on Christmas night, for the laudable purpose of helping to pay for a schoolhouse flag. The pupils, one and all, taking graciously to this plan. The preparations for a program were begun at once. And of all the excited performers elect, none was so excited as Anne Shirley, who threw herself into the undertaking heart and soul, hampered as she was by Marilla's disapproval. Marilla thought it all rank foolishness. It's just filling your heads up with nonsense and taking time that ought to be put on your lessons, she grumbled. I don't approve of children getting up concerts and racing about to practices. It makes them vain and forward and fond of gadding. But think of the worthy object, pleaded Anne. A flag will cultivate the spirit of patriotism, Marilla. Fudge! There's precious little patriotism in the thoughts of any of you. All you want is a good time. Well, when you can combine patriotism and fun, isn't it all right? Of course, it's real nice to be getting up a concert. We're going to have 6 choruses and Diana is going to sing a solo. I'm in 2 dialogues, the Society for the Suppression of Gossip and the Fairy Queen. The boys are going to have a dialogue too, and I think I'm to have 2 recitations, Marilla. I just tremble when I think of it, but it's a nice, thrilly kind of tremble. And we're to have a tableau at the last. Faith, Hope, and Charity. Diana and Ruby and I are to be in it, all draped in white with flowing hair. I'm to be Hope with my hands clasped, so, and my eyes uplifted. I'm going to practice my recitations in the garret. Don't be alarmed if you hear me groaning. I have to groan heart-rendingly in one of them, and it's really hard to get up a good artistic groan, Marilla. Josie Pye is sulky because she didn't get the part she wanted in the dialogue. She wanted to be the fairy queen. That would have been ridiculous, for whoever heard of a fairy queen as fat as Josie? Fairy queens must be slender. Jane Andrews is to be the queen, and I am to be one of her maids of honor. Josie says she thinks a red haired fairy is just as ridiculous as a fat one. But I do not let myself mind what Josie says. I am to have a wreath of white roses on my hair, and Ruby Gillis is to lend me her slippers because I haven't any of my own. It's necessary for fairies to have slippers, you know. You couldn't imagine a fairy wearing boots, could you? Especially with copper toes. We are going to decorate the hall with creeping spruce and fir mottos and pink tissue paper roses in them. And we are all to march in two by two after the audience is seated, while Emma White plays a march on the organ. Oh, Marilla, I know you are not so enthusiastic about it as I am, but don't you hope your little Anne will distinguish herself? All I hope is that you'll behave yourself. I'll be heartily glad when all this fuss is over and you'll be able to settle down. You are simply good for nothing just now, with your head stuffed full of dialogues and groans and tableaus. As for your tongue, it's a marvel it's not clean worn out. Anne sighed and betook herself to the backyard, over which a young new moon was shining through the leafless poplar boughs from an apple green western sky, and where Matthew was splitting wood. Anne perched herself on a block and talked the concert over with him, sure of an appreciative and sympathetic listener, in this instance at least. Well now, I reckon it's going to be a pretty good concert, and I expect you'll do your part fine, he said, smiling down into her eager, vivacious little face. Anne smiled back at him. Those two were the best of friends, and Matthew thanked his stars many a time and oft that he had nothing to do with bringing her up. That was Marilla's exclusive duty. If it had been his, he would have worried over frequent conflicts between inclination and said duty. As it was, he was free to spoil Anne, Marilla's phrasing, as much as he liked. But it was not such a bad arrangement after all. A little appreciation sometimes does quite as much good as all the conscientious bringing up in the world. End of chapter. You accidentally looked up blood in incarnate with all caps. Yeah, because you were using all caps over here. So just all caps blood. It's possible. Very possible indeed. I see. All right, should we just keep going? That chapter was mostly set up for the concert, I think. It's still good. And going on about fairy queens is really funny. Jo- I like that she just kind of moves right through it, but just like Josie shouldn't be a fairy queen because she's too fat. And then Josie immediately snaps back with, "Well, you can't be one because you're red haired." I just like how she like moves right through that argument that they clearly had at school. And that she's so honest about it. Like she doesn't try to like hide that she was arguing with her friend. She just explains it matter of factly. It's really endearing. Like she doesn't just say like that Josie was bad in it. She like explains how she she was insulting people, and then she explains exactly how she was insulted. Very funny. I've also noticed frequently throughout the entire book, she she constantly bathrooms and maps. The I'm your Google for making tabletop RPG maps. Fair enough. I won't talk about it extensively because this is our cozy corner stream, but um, I can tell you more after. I if unless they're like necessary because you're putting something in them, I usually just skip them. Most people don't notice that bathrooms don't exist, and if they do notice, they just make a little joke about it and move on. They're not really necessary unless you really want to make them. Um, Unless they're like something specific you're putting in there, like something in the bath or something like that. I usually just kind of don't bother because it's not real life. You don't need to put every single object that would be in a real house in a fake map. So do it if you want to. Just put a little bath, put tile down on the floor, put a sink in there if you want, put a little vanity if it's a bigger bathroom or a nicer bathroom. Keep it simple. Put a little drain on the ground if you want to make it look like a bathroom. Use like blue or white tiles or something like that. That usually gives the impression. So I do it. Simple as. What I was saying was I appreciate constantly throughout the book, anytime Anne is thinking about Gil, she instantly says Gilbert, like Gil, referring to Gilbert Blythe, and then immediately corrects herself to talk about like all the other boys in class, including him. It's constant ever since she started her rivalry with him. She'll always say his name first, and then immediately switch over to just being like, "Oh well, all the people at school." It's like Montgomery has kept like incredibly consistent with that. Every single time she's thinking about Gil, she says his name out loud first. It's really endearing. I just appreciate how she's not missed like a single. She's not missed a single one. It's been every single one the author has included that little detail. It's nice consistency. All right, let's move on. Chapter 25. Matthew insists on puffed sleeves. Matthew was having a bad 10 minutes of it. He had come into the kitchen in the twilight of a cold, grey December evening and had sat down in the woodbox corner to take off his heavy boots, unconscious of the fact that Anne and a bevy of her schoolmates were having a practice of the Fairy Queen in the sitting room. Presently, they came trooping through the hall and out into the kitchen, laughing and chattering gaily. They did not see Matthew, who shrank bashfully back into the shadows beyond the woodbox with a boot in one hand and a bootjack in the other, and he watched them shyly for the aforesaid 10 minutes as they put on caps and jackets and talked about the dialogue and the concert. Anne stood among them, bright eyed and animated as they, but Matthew suddenly became conscious that there was something about her different from her mate. And what worried Matthew was that the difference impressed in him as being something that should not exist. Anne had a brighter face and bigger, starrier eyes, more delicate features than the other. Even shy, unobservant Matthew had learned to take note of these things, but the difference that disturbed him did not consist of any of these respects. You're good to go? Okay, good. You're welcome. Hang on one sec. Gotta do something. Sorry to pause. All right, sorry about that. I had to just send a message quick. Matthew was haunted by this question long after the girls had gone, arm in arm down the long, hard frozen lane, and Anne had betaken herself to her books. Could not refer it to Marilla, who he felt would be quite sure to sniff scornfully and remark that the only difference she saw between Anne and the other girls was that they sometimes kept their tongues quiet, while Anne never did this. This, Matthew felt, would be no great help. He had recourse to his pipe that evening to help him study it out, much to Marilla's disgust. After 2 hours of smoking and hard reflection, Matthew arrived at a solution of his problem. Anne was not dressed like the other girls. The more Matthew thought about the matter, the more he was convinced that Anne had never been dressed like the other girl, never since she had come to Green Gable. Marilla kept her clothed in plain, dark dresses, all made after the same unvarying pattern. If Matthew knew there was such a thing as fashion in dress, it was as much as he did. But he was never quite sure that Anne's sleeves. But he was quite sure that Anne's sleeves did not look at all like the sleeves of the other girls wore. He recalled in the he recalled the cluster of little girls he had seen around her that evening, all gay in waists of red and blue and pink and white, and he wondered why Marilla always kept her so plainly and soberly gowned. Of course, it must be all right. Marilla knew best, and Marilla was bringing her up. Probably some wise, unscrutable motive was to be served thereby. But surely it would do no harm to let the child have one pretty dress, something like Diana Barry always wore. Matthew decided that he would give her one, but that surely could not be objected to as an unwarranted putting in of his oar. Christmas was only a fortnight off. A nice new dress would be the very thing for a present. Matthew, with a sigh of satisfaction, put away his pipe and went to bed, while Marilla opened all the doors and aired the house. He doesn't like the fight. That's funny. The very next evening, Matthew betook himself to Carmody to buy the dress, determined to get the worst over and have done with it. It would be, he felt assured, no trifling ordeal. There were some things Matthew could buy and prove himself no mean bargainer. But he knew he would be at the mercy of shopkeepers when it came to buying a girl's dress. After much cogitation, Matthew resolved to go to Samuel Lawson's store instead of William Blair's. To be sure, the Cuthberts always had gone to William Blair's. It was almost as much a matter of conscience with them as to attend the Presbyterian church and vote Conservative. But William Blair's two daughters frequently waited on customers there, and Matthew held them in absolute dread. He could contrive to deal with them when he knew exactly what he wanted and could point it out, but in such a manner as this, requiring explanation and consultation, Matthew felt that he must be sure of a man behind the counter. So he would go to Lawson's, where Samuel, or his son, would wait on him. Alas, Matthew did not know that Samuel, in the recent expansion of his business, had set up a lady clerk also. She was a niece of his wife's, and a very dashing young person indeed, with a huge drooping pompadour, big rolling brown eyes, and a most extensive and bewildering smile. She was dressed with exceeding smartness and wore several bangle bracelets that glittered and rattled and tinkled with every movement of her hand. Matthew was covered with confusion at finding her there at all, and those bangles completely wrecked his wits at one fell swoop. "What can I do for you this evening, Mr. Cuthbert?" said Miss Lucilla Harris inquired, briskly and ingratiatingly, tapping the counter with both hands. "Have you any, well now, say any garden rakes?" stammered Matthew. Miss Harris looked somewhat surprised, as well she might, to hear a man inquiring for garden rakes in the middle of December. "I believe we have one or two left over," she said, "but they're upstairs in the lumber room. I'll go and see." During her absence, Matthew collected his scattered senses for another effort. When Miss Harris returned with the rake and cheerfully inquired, "Anything else tonight, Mr. Cuthbert?" Matthew took his courage in both hands and replied, "Well, now, since you suggest it, I might as well buy some hayseed." Miss Harris had heard Matthew Cuthbert called odd. She now concluded that he was entirely crazy. "You only keep hayseed in the spring," she explained loftily. "We've none on hand just now." "Oh, certainly, just as you say," stammered unhappy Matthew, seizing the rake and making for the door. At the threshold, he recollected that he had not paid for it and turned miserably back. While Miss Harris was counting out his change, he rallied his powers for a final, desperate attempt. "Well, now, if it isn't too much trouble, I might as well. That is, I'd like to look at some sugar." "White or brown?" queried Miss Harry patiently. "Oh, well, now, brown," said Matthew feebly. "There's a barrel of it over there," said Miss Harris, shaking her bangles at it. "It's the only kind we have." I'll I'll take 20 pounds of it, said Matthew, with beads of perspiration standing on his forehead. Matthew had driven halfway home before he was his own man again. It had been a gruesome experience, but it served him right, he thought, for committing the heresy of going to a strange store. When he reached home, he hid the rake in the tool house, but the sugar he carried in to Marilla. Brown sugar? Exclaimed Marilla. Whatever possessed you to get so much? You know I never use it except for the hired man's porridge or black fruit cake. Jerry's gone, and I've made my cake long ago. It's not good sugar either. It's coarse and dark. William Blair doesn't usually keep sugar like that. I I thought it might come in handy sometime, said Matthew, making good his escape. When Matthew came to think the matter over, he decided that a woman was required to cope with the situation. Marilla was out of the question. Matthew felt sure she would throw cold water on his project at once. Remained only Mrs. Lynde. For no other woman in Avonlea would Matthew have dared to ask advice. To Mrs. Lynde he went accordingly, and that good lady promptly took the matter out of the harassed man's hands. Pick out a dress for you to give to Anne. To be sure I will. I'm going to Carmody tomorrow, and I'll attend to it. Have you something particular in mind? No? Well, I'll just go by my own judgment then. I believe a nice rich brown would just suit Anne, and William Blair has some new Gloria in that's real pretty. Perhaps you'd like to make it up for her too, seeing that if Marilla was to make it, Anne would probably get wind of it before the time and spoil the surprise. Well, I'll just do it. No, it isn't a mite of trouble. I like sewing. I'll make it to fit my niece, Jenny Gillis, for she and Anne are as like as two peas as far as figure go. Well, now, I'm much obliged, said Matthew. And I don't know, but I think they make the sleeves different nowadays, what they used to be. If it wouldn't be asking too much, I'd like to make them in the new way. Puffs? Of course. Needn't worry a speck about it, Matthew. I'll make it up in the very latest fashion, said Mrs. Lynde. To herself, she added when Matthew had gone, It'll be a real satisfaction to see that poor child wearing something decent for once. The way Marilla dresses her is positively ridiculous, that's what. And I've ached to tell her so plainly a dozen times. I've held my tongue, though, for I can see Marilla doesn't want advice, and she thinks she knows more about bringing up children than I do, for all she's an old maid. But that's always the way. Folk that has brought up children know that there's no hard and fast method in the world that'll suit every child. I'll just set your 3 terms down so fashion, and the sum'll work out correct. But flesh and blood don't come under the head of arithmetic, and that's where Marilla Cuthbert makes her mistake. I suppose she's trying to cultivate a spirit of humility in Anne by dressing her as she does, but it's more likely to cultivate envy and discontent. I'm sure the child must feel the difference between her clothes and the other girls, but to think of Matthew taking notice of it, that man is waking up after being asleep for over 60 years. Marilla knew all the following fortnight that Matthew had something on his mind, but what it was she could not guess until Christmas Eve, when Mrs. Lynde brought up the new dress. Marilla behaved pretty well on the whole, although it is very likely she distrusted Mrs. Lynde's diplomatic explanation that she had made the dress because Matthew was afraid Anne would find out about it too soon if Marilla made it. So this is what Matthew has been looking so mysterious over and grinning about to himself for 2 weeks, is it? He said a little stiffly, but tolerantly. I knew he was up to some foolishness. Well, I must say I don't think Anne needed any more dresses. I made her 3 good, warm, serviceable ones this fall, and anything more is sheer extravagance. There's enough material in those sleeves alone to make a waist, I declare there is. You'll just pamper Anne's vanity, Matthew, and she's as vain as a peacock now. Well, I hope she'll be satisfied at last, for I know she's been hankering after those silly sleeves ever since they came in, although she never said a word after the first. The puffs have been getting bigger and more ridiculous right along. They're as big as balloons now. Next year, anybody who wears them will have to go through a door sideways. Christmas morning broke on a beautiful white world. It had been a very mild December, and people had looked forward to a green Christmas. But just enough snow fell softly in the night to transfigure Avonlea. Anne peeped out from her frosted gable window with delighted eyes. The firs in the haunted wood were all feathery and wonderful. The birches and wild cherry trees were outlined in pearl. Plowed fields were stretches of snowy dimples, and there was a crisp tang in the air that was glorious. Anne ran downstairs singing until her voice re-echoed through Green Gables. Merry Christmas, Marilla. Merry Christmas, Matthew. Isn't it a lovely Christmas? I'm so glad it's white. Any other kind of Christmas doesn't feel real, does it? I don't like green Christmases. They're not green, they're just nasty faded browns and grays. What makes people call them green? Why, why, Matthew, is that for me? Oh, Matthew. Matthew had sheepishly unfolded the dress from its paper swathings and held it out with a deprecatory glance at Marilla, who feigned to be contemptuously filling the teapot, but nevertheless watched the scene out of the corner of her eye with a rather interested air. Anne took the dress and looked at it in reverent silence. Oh, how pretty it was! A lovely soft brown Gloria with all the gloss of silk, a skirt with dainty frills and shirrings, a waist elaborately pin-tucked in the most fashionable way, with a little ruffle of filmy lace at the neck, but the sleeves, they were the crowning glory. Long elbow cuffs, and above them two beautiful puffs divided by rows of shirring and bows of brown silk ribbon. That's a Christmas present for you, Anne, said Matthew shyly. Why, why, Anne, don't you like it? Well, no. For Anne's eyes had suddenly filled with tears. Like it? Oh, Matthew. Anne laid the dress over a chair and clasped her hands. Matthew, it's perfectly exquisite. Oh, I can never thank you enough. Look at those sleeves. Oh, it seems to me this must be a happy dream. Well, let us have breakfast, interrupted Marilla. I must say, Anne, I don't think you needed the dress, but since Matthew has got it for you, see that you take good care of it. There's a hair ribbon Mrs. Lynde left for you. It's brown to match the dress. Come now, sit in. I don't see how I'm going to eat breakfast, said Anne rapturously. Breakfast seems so commonplace at such an exciting moment. I'd rather feast my eyes on that dress. I'm so glad that puff sleeves are still fashionable. It did seem to me that I'd never get over it if they went out before I had a dress with them. I'd never have felt such I'd never have felt quite satisfied, you see. It was lovely of Mrs. Lynde to give me the ribbon, too. I feel that I ought to be a very good girl indeed. It's at times like this I'm sorry I'm not a model little girl, and I always resolve that I will be in the future. But somehow it's hard to carry out on your resolutions when irresistible temptations come. Still, I really will make an extra effort after this. When the commonplace breakfast was over, Diana appeared, crossing the white log bridge in the hollow, a gay little figure in her crimson ulster. Anne flew down the slope to meet her. Merry Christmas, Diana! And oh, it's a wonderful Christmas! I've something splendid to show you. Matthew has given me the loveliest dress with such sleeves. Couldn't even imagine any nicer. I've got something for you, said Diana breathlessly. Here, this box. Aunt Josephine sent us out a big box with ever so many things in it, and this is for you. I'd have brought it over last night, but it didn't come until very dark. It didn't come until after dark, and I never feel very comfortable coming through the haunted wood in the dark now. Anne opened the box and peeped in. First a card with "For Anne Girl" and "Merry Christmas" written on it, and then a pair of the daintiest little kid slippers, with beaded toes and satin bows and glistening buckles. Oh, Diana, this is too much. I must be dreaming, said Anne. I call it providential, said Diana. You won't have to borrow Ruby's slippers now, and that's a blessing, for they're 2 sizes too big for you, and it would be awful to hear a fairy shuffling. Josie Pye would be delighted. Mind you, Rob Wright went home with Gertie Pye from the practice night before last. Did you ever hear anything equal to that? All the Avonlea scholars were in a fever of excitement that day, for the hall had to be decorated and a last grand rehearsal held. The concert came off in the evening and was a pronounced success. The little hall was crowded, all the performers did excellently well, but Anne was the bright particular star of the occasion, as even envy, in the shape of Josie Pye, dared not deny. Oh, hasn't it been a brilliant evening, sighed Anne, when it was all over and she and Diana were walking home together under a dark, starry sky. Everything went off very well, said Diana practically. I guess we must have made as much as $10. Mind you, Mr. Allen is going to send an account of it to the Charlatan papers. Oh, Diana, will we really see our names in print? It makes me feel a thrill just to think of it. Your solo was perfectly elegant, Diana. I felt prouder than you did when it was encored. I just said to myself, it is dear my bosom friend who is so honored. Well, your recitations just brought down the house, Anne. That sad one was simply splendid. Oh, I was so nervous, Diana. When Mr. Allen called out my name, I really cannot tell how I ever got up on that platform. I felt as if a million eyes were looking at me and through me, and for one dreadful moment I was sure I couldn't begin at all. Then I thought of my lovely puffed sleeves and took courage. I knew that I must live up to those sleeves, Diana. So I started in, and my voice seemed to be coming from ever so far away. I just felt like a parrot. It's providential that I practiced those recitations so often up in the garret, or I'd never been able to get through. Did I groan all right? Yes, indeed, you groaned lovely, assured Diana. I saw old Mrs. Sloane wiping away tears when I sat down. It was splendid to think I had touched somebody's heart. It's so romantic to take part in a concert, isn't it? Oh, it's been a very memorable occasion indeed. Wasn't the boy's dialogue fine? Said Diana. Gilbert Blythe was just splendid, Anne. And I do think it's awful the way you treat Gil. I do think it's awful mean the way you treat Gil. Wait till I tell you. When you ran off the platform after the fairy dialogue, one of your roses fell out of your hair. I saw Gil pick it up and put it in his breast pocket. There now, you're so romantic that I'm sure you ought to be pleased by that. It's nothing to me what that person does, said Anne loftily. I never waste a thought on him, Diana. That night, Marilla and Matthew, who had been out to a concert for the first time in 20 years, sat a while by the kitchen fire after Anne had gone to bed. Well, now, I guess our Anne did as well as any of them, said Matthew proudly. Yes, she did, admitted Marilla. She's a bright child, Matthew, and she looked real nice, too. I've been kind of opposed to this concert scheme, but I suppose there's no real harm in it after all. Anyhow, I was proud of Anne tonight, although I'm not going to tell her so. Well, now, I was proud of her, and I did tell her so, before she went upstairs, said Matthew. We must see what we can do for her some of these days, Marilla. I guess she'll need something more than Avonlea School by and by. There's time enough to think of that, said Marilla. She's only 13 in March, though tonight it struck me she was growing quite a big girl. Mrs. Lynde made that dress a mite too long, and it makes Anne look so tall. She's quick to learn, and I guess the best thing we can do for her will be to send her to Queen's after a spell. But nothing need be said about that for a year or two yet. Well, now, it'll do no harm to be thinking of it over, off, and on, said Matthew. Things like that are all the better for lots of thinking over. End of chapter. the bit the bit where Matthew is just absolutely struggling to just ask for a dress and dress material is really, really funny. The way that he keeps like doubling back to just like buying things that would be normal for any other time of year, but buying like a rake and sugar and stuff, and just he keeps trying to like muster up his courage and then just quickly doubles back to whatever the first thing his brain comes up with. Is really funny. The guy is just painfully shy. He's just like me for real. Yeah. He's very relatable and very sweet. Such a nice old man. Me when I walk into a store and have to ask a worker anything. Yeah, exactly. I feel like a lot of people these days like hate making like phone calls and would rather just like text. And I feel like anyone who's that way can relate with Matthew in like every extent. Yeah, and like having to ask people behind the counter when you're doing stuff like that. Yeah, you hate making phone calls. Yeah, exactly. It really is very relatable, huh? Just painfully shy, difficulty talking to people. Doubling back onto whatever you're comfortable with asking about. I like talking to people face to face and not not making phone calls. Yeah, I feel like a lot of people don't make phone calls, especially younger people. For sure, I imagine old boomers are fine with it. I say being 600 years old. Like I can go to the doctor and make an appointment, but calling on the phone, yeah, brutal. Bad, awful. I had to reschedule my hair appointment. They kept talking over her, and oh my god, it was so awful. I was just sitting there in my car on the phone. Yeah, yeah. Phone calls are just less fun. Everybody should just email. You don't need phones anymore. They're out of date. Your time is gone. Hang on. Okay. Question for chat is if you could replace all of your phone calls with a video call, would that be better? There's a good question for you. Would that be better if you had to do if all phone calls didn't exist anymore and you had to video call instead of phone calling? Would that be better or worse? That's what I'm curious about. If you were given the choice of either like you couldn't text or email them, you could either phone call them or video call them. Which would you prefer? We've gotten a little sidetracked, but I'm curious about this. You think yes because you like talking people to people face to face, but it also means you had to do your makeup before you talk to everyone. But you honestly do like video calls. That's fair enough. Yeah, you would require like prep work more so than a phone call does, I imagine. If you had to video call everybody, like you're in like some cyberpunk universe where you any time you call someone, it just like pulls up the holographic video feed of them. You're like, hang on, wait, what's in the background of my shot? Wait, is there some mess I need to clean up? What am I wearing? Am I in my pajamas? You had to interview for your job on video, and it was nice, but I'd rather have just met them in person. Yeah, that's fair enough. I don't know what I would prefer. I think I like anonymity, so I think what like just phone calls are better. I don't think I like showing people my face. They don't need to look at me. You're in a different state though, yeah, fair enough. Man, this tea is really bitter. I didn't make it very well. Maybe I've accidentally put poison in it. Maybe I had an Anne moment and I've poisoned myself. But I accidentally put the anodyne liniment in my tea instead of the tea leaves. Well, if you guys don't hear from me, you know what happened. I've and myself. This is a me thing, but honestly, I think it's cool how anonymous you are. I mean, like you want to know more about me, but the mystery makes it interesting. Yeah, I'm a mysterious fellow. I run a magic school. You have to have an air of mystery if you're going to be the headmaster of a magic school. If everybody knows every little detail about you, then it doesn't make for a very interesting magical figure, does it? The mystery is part of the romance of it all, as Anne would say. Oh, it is ever so romantic to have an air of mystery, isn't it, Marilla? I wish I had an air of mystery. That's what she was saying. I'm starting to think like I am. Maybe I've always thought like I am. That might be the case. I do like imagination. Kindred spirit, indeed. Shall we keep going? You're like, oh yes, I eat food. Sometimes I don't need to eat food. I just do it because it's fun. I am an undead lich, so I don't actually require it, but it is sometimes fun to amuse yourself with food, and I like cooking it. Ever since the Roman numerals are getting harder, even though we're just going sequentially by chapter. For some reason, my brain always has like a panic moment every time I look at it. I'm like, wait, what is that? What is that? Oh God. What is it? No, that's 20. That's 6. Dummy. 26. Easy. It is genuinely really easy. It's just for some reason every time I look at it, it looks like complete gibberish until I just take one moment and realize what it is. We're going up by 1, so you just have to add 1 to the previous number, Charlemagne. What's wrong with you? Ooh, the story club is formed, huh? Hell yeah, that sounds like it's up our alley. Chapter 26. Wait, hang on. I should probably check if I have a message on my that I need to answer before I start this chapter, otherwise I won't be able to answer to the end. No, we're all good. We are the story club? True, that's us. Yeah, Anne really is a kindred spirit, huh? For like tabletop. Anne would be a really good DM. She'd be a really good dungeon master. Let's be honest. That shit would slap, but she would forget that she has sessions every other day. All right. Chapter 26. The story club is formed. She would accidentally poison her place. Yeah. It's really immersive though. Like the villain was trying to poison you and then Anne would do it too. You'd all be accidentally drunk and the session would be a complete disaster, but it would be fun. I've made you all snacks and then it's like, yeah, it's arsenic cupcakes. Whoops. You mean that wasn't vanilla extract? Oopsie. Little mistake. We love Anne in this house. True. In this stream we are very staunch Anne Shirley, Anne of Green Gables supporters. We support her oopsie daisies. She's innocent. She didn't do it, Your Honor. All right, let's keep going. Chapter 26. Story Club is formed. Junior Avonlea found it hard to settle down to humdrum existence again. To Anne in particular, things seemed fearfully flat, stale, and unprofitable after the goblet of excitement she had been sipping for weeks. That's really nice. Like prose. That's kind of a beautiful way to state that. Could she go back to the former quiet pleasures of those faraway days before the concert? At first, she told Diana she did not really think she could. I'm positively certain, Diana, that life can never be quite the same again as it was in those olden days. She said mournfully, as if referring to a period of at least 50 years back. Perhaps after a while I'll get used to it, but I'm afraid concerts spoil people for everyday life. I suppose that is why Marilla disapproves of them. Marilla is such a sensible woman. I must be a great deal better. It must be a great deal better to be sensible, but still, I don't believe I'd really want to be a sensible person, because they are ever so unromantic. Mrs. Lynde says there is no danger of my ever being one, but you can never tell. I feel just now that I may grow up to be sensible yet, but perhaps that is only because I'm tired. I simply couldn't sleep last night for ever so long. I just lay awake and, and imagine the concert over and over and over again. That's one splendid thing about such affairs. It's so lovely to look back to them. Eventually, however, Avonlea School slipped back into its old groove and took up its old interests. To be sure, the concert left traces. Ruby Gillis and Emma White, who had quarreled over a point of precedence in their platform seats, no longer sat at the same desk, and a promising friendship of 3 years was broken up. Josie Pye and Julia Bell did not speak for 3 months because Josie Pye had told Bessie Wright that Julia Bell's bow, when she got up to recite, made her think of a chicken jerking its head. And Bessie told Julia. None of the Sloanes would have any dealings with the Bells because the Bells had declared that the Sloanes had too much to do in the program, and the Sloanes had retorted that the Bells were not capable of doing the little they had to do properly. Finally, Charlie Sloane fought Moody Spurgeon McPherson because Moody Spurgeon was a cool name, had said that Anne Shirley put on airs about her recitations, and Moody Spurgeon was licked consequently, and Moody Spurgeon was licked, to say beaten up, essentially. Consequently, Moody Spurgeon's sister, Ellen May, would not speak to Anne Shirley all the rest of the winter. With the exception of these trifling frictions, work in Miss Stacy's little kingdom went on with regularity and smoothness. The winter weeks slipped by. It was an unusually mild winter with so little snow that Anne and Diana could go to school nearly every day by way of the birch path. On Anne's birthday, they were tripping lightly down it, keeping eyes and ears alert amid all their chatter. For Miss Stacy had told them that they must soon write a composition on a winter's walk in the woods, and it behooved them to be observant. Just think, Diana, I'm 13 years old today, remarked Anne in an awed voice. I can scarcely realize that I'm in my teens. When I woke this morning, it seemed to me that everything must be different. I've been 13 for a month, so I suppose it doesn't seem such a novelty to you as it does to me. It makes life seem so much more interesting. In 2 more years, I'll be really grown up. It's such a great comfort to think that I'll be able to use big words then without being laughed at. Ruby Gillis says she means to have a beau as soon as she's 15, said Diana. Ruby Gillis thinks of nothing but beaux, said Anne disdainfully. She's actually delighted when anyone writes her name up in a take notice, for all she pretends to be so mad. But I'm afraid that is an uncharitable speech. Mrs. Allen says we should never make uncharitable speeches. But they do slip out so often before you think, don't they? I simply can't talk about Josie Pye without making an uncharitable speech, so I never mention her at all. You may have noticed that. I'm trying to be as much like Mrs. Allen as I possibly can, for I think she's perfect. Mr. Allen thinks so too. Mrs. Lynde says he just worships the ground she treads on, and she doesn't really think it right for a minister to set his affections so much on a mortal being. But then, Diana, even ministers are human, and have their besetting sins, just like everybody else. I had such an interesting talk with Mrs. Allen about besetting sins last Sunday afternoon. There are just a few things it's proper to talk about on Sundays, and that is one of them. My besetting sin is imagining too much and forgetting my duties. I'm striving very hard to overcome it, and now that I'm really 13, perhaps I'll get on better. In 4 more years, we'll be able to put our hair out, said Diana. Alice Bell is only 16 and she's wearing hers up, but I think that's ridiculous. I shall wait until I'm 17. If I had Alice Bell's crooked nose, said Anne decidedly, I wouldn't. But there, I won't say what I was going to because it was extremely uncharitable. Besides, I was comparing it with my own nose, and that's vanity. I'm afraid I think too much about my nose ever since I heard that compliment about it long ago. It really is a great comfort to me. Oh, Diana, look, there's a rabbit. That's something to remember for our woods composition. I really think the woods are just as lovely in winter as in summer. They're so white and still, as if they were asleep and dreaming in pretty dreams. I won't mind writing that composition when its time comes, sighed Diana. I can manage to write about the woods, but the one we're to hand in Monday is terrible. The idea of Miss Stacy telling us to write a story out of our own heads. Why, it's as easy as a wink, said Anne. It's easy for you because you have an imagination, retorted Diana. But what would you do if you had been born without one? I suppose you have your composition all done. Anne nodded, trying hard not to look virtuously complacent and failing miserably. I wrote it last Monday evening. It's called The Jealous Rival, or In Death Not Divided. I read it to Marilla and she said it was stuff and nonsense. Then I read it to Matthew and he said it was fine. That is the kind of critic I like. It's a sad, sweet story. I just cried like a child while I was writing it. It's about two beautiful maidens called Cordelia Montmorency and Geraldine Seymour, who lived in the same village and were devotedly attached to each other. Cordelia was a regal brunette with a coronet of midnight hair and duskly flashing eyes. Geraldine was a queenly blonde with hair like spun gold and velvety purple eyes. I never saw anyone with purple eyes, said Diana dubiously. Neither did I. I just imagined them. I wanted something out of the common. Geraldine had an alabaster brow, too. I found out what an alabaster brow is. That is one of the advantages of being 13. You know such more you know so much more than you did when you were only 12. Well, what became of Cordelia and Geraldine? Asked Diana, who was beginning to feel rather interested in their fate. They grew in beauty side by side until they were 16. Then Bertram de Vere came to their native village and fell in love with the fair Geraldine. He saved her life when her horse ran away with her in a carriage, and she fainted in his arms, and he carried her home 3 miles. Because you understand, the carriage was all smashed up. I found it rather hard to imagine the proposal because I had no experience to go by. I asked Ruby Gillis if she knew anything about how men proposed, because I thought she'd likely be an authority on the subject, having so many sisters married. Ruby told me she was hid in the hall pantry when Malcolm Andres proposed to her sister Susan. She said Malcolm told Susan that his dad had given him the farm in his own name and then said, "What do you say, darling pet, if we get hitched this fall?" And Susan said, "Yes, no, I don't know. Let me see." And then they were engaged as quick as that. But I didn't think that sort of proposal was a very romantic one. So in the end I had to imagine it out as well as I could. I made it very flowery and poetical, and Bertram went on his knees, although Ruby Gillis says it isn't done nowadays. Geraldine accepted him in a speech a page long. I can tell you I took a lot of trouble with that speech. I rewrote it 5 times and looked upon it as my masterpiece. Bertram gave her a diamond ring and a ruby necklace and told her they would go to Europe for a wedding tour, for he was immensely wealthy. But then, alas, shadows began to darken over their path. Cordelia was secretly in love with Bertram herself, and when Geraldine told her about the engagement, she was simply furious, especially when she saw the necklace and diamond ring. All her affection for Geraldine turned to bitter hate, and she vowed that she should never marry Bertram. But she pretended to be Gerald's friend the same as ever. One evening, when they were standing on the bridge over a rushing, turbulent stream, and Cordelia, thinking they were alone, pushed Geraldine over the brink with a wild, mocking "ha ha ha." But Bertram saw it all, and he at once plunged into the current, exclaiming, "I will save thee, my peerless Geraldine." But alas, he had forgotten he couldn't swim, and they were both drowned, clasped in each other's arms. Their bodies were washed ashore soon afterwards. They were buried in the one grave, and their funeral was most imposing, Diana. It's so much more romantic to end a story with a funeral than a wedding. As for Cordelia, she went insane with remorse and was shut up in a lunatic asylum. I thought that was a poetical retribution for her crime. How perfectly lovely, sighed Diana, who belonged to Matthew's school of critics. I don't see how you can make up such thrilling things out of your own head, Anne. I wish my imagination was as good as yours. It would be if only you'd cultivate it, said Anne cheeringly. I've just thought of a plan, Diana. Let you and me have a story club all our own and write stories for practice. I'll help you along until you can do them by yourself. You want to cultivate your imagination, you know. Miss Stacy says so. Only we must take the right way. I told her about the haunted woods, but she said we went the wrong way about it in that. This was how the story club came into existence. It was limited to Diana and Anne at first, but soon it was extended to include Jane Andrews and Ruby Gillis and 1 or 2 others who felt that their imaginations needed cultivating. No boys were allowed in it, although Ruby Gillis opined that their admission would make it more exciting, and each member had to produce 1 story a week. It's extremely interesting, Anne told Marilla. Each girl has to read her story out loud and then we talk it over. We're going to keep them all sacredly and have them read to our descendants. We each write under a nom de plume. Mine is Rosamond Montmorency. And all the girls do pretty well. All the girls do pretty well. Ruby Gillis is rather sentimental. She puts too much lovemaking into her stories, and you know too much is worse than too little. Jane never puts any because she says it makes her feel so silly when she had to read it out loud. Jane's stories are extremely sensible. Then Diana puts too many murders into hers. She says most of the time she doesn't know what to do with all the people, so she kills them off to get rid of them. I mostly always have to tell them what to write about, but that isn't hard, for I have millions of ideas. Diana puts too many murders. She doesn't know what to do, so she just kills them all. Relatable. Very relatable, Diana. I think this story writing business is the foolishest yet, scoffed Marilla. You'll get a pack of nonsense into your heads and waste time that should be put on your lessons. Reading stories is bad enough, but writing them is worse. But we're so careful to put a moral into all of them, Marilla, explained Anne. I insist upon that. All the good people are rewarded and all the bad ones are suitably punished. I'm sure that must have a wholesome effect. The moral is the great thing. Mr. Allen says so. I read one of my stories to him and Mrs. Allen, and they both agreed that the moral was excellent. Only they laughed in the wrong places. I like it better when people cry. Jane and Ruby almost always cry when I come to the pathetic parts. Diana wrote her Aunt Josephine about our club, and her Aunt Josephine wrote back that we were to send her some of our stories. So we copied out 4 of our very best and sent them. Miss Josephine Barry wrote back that she had never read anything so amusing in her life. That kind of puzzled us because the stories were all very pathetic and almost everybody died. But I'm glad Miss Barry liked them. It shows our club is doing some good in the world. Mrs. Allen says that ought to be our object in everything. I do really try to make it my object, but I forget so often when I'm having fun. I hope I shall be a little like Mrs. Allen when I grow up. Do you think there is any prospect of it, Marilla? I shouldn't say there was a great deal, was Marilla's encouraging answer. I'm sure Mrs. Allen was never such a silly, forgetful little girl as you are. No, but she wasn't always so good as she is now either, said Anne seriously. She told me herself. That is, she said she was a dreadful mischief when she was a girl and was always getting into scrapes. I felt so encouraged when I heard that. It is very wicked of me, Marilla, to feel encouraged when I hear that other people have been bad and mischievous. Is it very wicked? That's what she said. Sorry, there's a question mark there. Mrs. Lynde says it is. Mrs. Lynde says she always feels shocked when she hears of anyone ever having been so naughty, no matter how small they were. Mrs. Lynde says she once heard a minister confess that when he was a boy, he stole a strawberry tart out of his aunt's pantry, and she never had any respect for that minister again. Now, I wouldn't have felt that way. I'd have thought it was real noble of him to confess it, and I'd have thought what an encouraging thing it would be for small boys nowadays who do naughty things and are sorry for them to know that perhaps they may grow up to be ministers in spite of it. That's how I'd feel, Marilla. The way I feel at present, Anne, said Marilla, is that it's high time you had those dishes washed. You've taken half an hour longer than you should with all your chattering. Learn to work first and talk afterwards. End of chapter. the bit, the bit about the bit about Diana adding murders into all of hers is so funny. She doesn't know what to do with the characters, so she just kills them off. Yeah, valid. Yeah, valid. Like you guys are saying. Well, I don't know what to do with this character. Just get rid of him. Diana is just like me for real. Charlemagne, can we make a story club? That would be kind of fun. It would probably get really exhausting to have to write a story every week though. But we could stretch that timeline a little bit. I do like writing. That's basically what D&D is. It's kind of just a story club, except you're just not writing any of the main characters, right? You're writing together with friends. You're just doing it at the same time instead of writing ahead of time and then sharing it. Got to get my practice in. Yeah, it is valid. It would be fun. Though one per week would be a lot of work. Story club, except one of my characters is a clown and I cannot stop it. Yeah. That's what D&D is basically. It's just you write stories and then you don't control any of the main characters and they just do what they want in your story, which is good practice for writing anyway. I find it kind of hard to differentiate my voices between Diana and Anne because Missouri's like the protagonist of all protagonists. I mean, I'm glad you think so. She probably doesn't consider herself the protagonist though. Um, it's hard to like differentiate the voices of Diana and Anne because they're both like young girls and they both would have an Irish background, right? They wouldn't have an actual strong accent because they are Canadian born, but a lot of their families would have it, and so it would be like slightly more present than it would be in the modern day. And the east coast of Canada does have a present accent from um those old European countries that they all stem from. So even today, if you go to places like Newfoundland, you will hear that Newfie accent, and it's present in PEI as well. So I've been trying to give them a little bit of that. A lot of the characters who have that British and Irish background, because Anne Shirley would certainly have one. What with her red hair, and Diana Berry Berry is just an Irish last name, so they would both kind of have one. But that ends up with their voices sounding a little bit the same. So I can't really differentiate them, but that's all right. They don't need to be that different. I try to give Diana's voice a bit more of a practical kind of seriousness, and Anne has a bit of whimsy more to her voice. She lopes around a little bit more. I'm doing my best. Matthew's the easiest one to voice because he's like the only guy in the book. You're doing great, King. Thank you. Doing my best, and I'm having fun. So I hope you guys don't think that I was just really bad at doing an Irish accent because I can do one. As Silver Song and Three Crowns and Misery have proved. But I'm trying to do a Canadian accent with a hint of Irish, which comes out as just very soft Irish. I have heard the accent quite a lot, so I don't think I'm that bad. One more chapter and you'll be done with your math. I like that you're measuring time by chapters. That's funny. We can keep going. I said that we might split it a little differently because I forget how many chapters there are left, but if we just do 10 today, then we'll have a shorter stream next time. So we can maybe stop at like 9, depending if it's a good place to end, and then we'll have a little bit more chapters for the last stream. We'll have like 8 or something for the last stream. We'll see. We'll just play it by ear. We've already been going for 2.5 hours, so at 3 hours we'll see how we feel. We'll do like another 2 chapters, see how we feel, and then we'll decide to either stop and leave more for next time or read more now if we're really into it and we need to know what happens. I am really into this book, but we'll play it by ear. Let's continue. Chapter 27. Vanity and Vexation of Spirit. Marilla, walking home one late April evening from an aid meeting, realized that the winter was over and gone with the thrill of delight that spring never fails to bring to the oldest and saddest, as well as to the youngest and merriest. Marilla was not given to subjective analysis of her thoughts and feelings. She probably imagined that she was thinking about the aides and their missionary box, and the new carpet for the vestry room. But under these reflections was a harmonious consciousness of red fields smoking into pale purply mists in the declining sun, of long, sharp pointed fir shadows falling over the meadow beyond the brook, of still crimson budded maples around a mirror like wood pool, of awakening in the world, and a stir of hidden pulses under the grey sod. Spring was abroad in the land, and Marilla's sober, middle aged step was lighter and swifter because of its deep, primal gladness. Her eyes dwelt affectionately on Green Gables, peering through its network of trees and reflecting the sunlight back from its windows and in several little coruscations of glory. Marilla, as she picked her steps along the damp lane, thought that it really was a satisfaction to know that she was going home to a briskly snapping wood fire and a table nicely spread for tea, instead of to the comfort of old instead of to the cold comfort of old aid meeting evenings before Anne had come to Green Gables. Consequently, when Marilla entered her kitchen and found the fire black out, with no sign of Anne anywhere, she felt justly disappointed and irritated. She had told Anne to be sure and have tea ready at 5 o'clock, but now she must hurry to take off her second best dress and prepare the meal herself against Matthew's return from plowing. I'll settle Miss Anne when she comes home, said Marilla grimly, as she shaved up kindlings with a carving knife and with more vim than was strictly necessary. Matthew had come in and was waiting patiently for his tea in his corner. She's gadding off somewhere with Diana, writing stories or practicing dialogues or some such tomfoolery, and never thinking once about the time of or her duties. She's just got to be pulled up short and sudden on this sort of thing. I don't care if Mrs. Allen says she's the brightest and sweetest child she ever knew. She may be bright and sweet enough, but her head is full of nonsense, and there's never any knowing what shape it'll break out in next. Just as soon as she grows out of one freak, she takes up with another. But there, here I am saying the very thing I was so riled up with Rachel Lynde for saying at the aid today. I was real glad when Mrs. Allen spoke up for Anne, for if she hadn't, I know I'd have said something too sharp to Rachel before everybody. Anne's got plenty of faults, goodness knows, and far be it from me to deny it, but I'm bringing her up and not Rachel Lynde, who'd pick her faults in the angel Gabriel himself if he lived in Avonlea. Just the same, Anne had no business to leave the house just like this when I told her she was to stay home this afternoon and look after things. I must say, with all her faults, I never found her disobedient or untrustworthy before, and I'm real sorry to find her so now. Well, now, I don't know, said Matthew, who, being patient and wise and above all hungry, had deemed it best to let Marilla talk her wrath out unhindered, having learned by experience that she got through with whatever work was on hand much quicker if not delayed by untimely argument. Perhaps you're judging her too hasty, Marilla. Don't call her untrustworthy until you're sure she has disobeyed you. Maybe it all can be explained. Anne's a great hand at explaining. She's not here when I told her to stay, retorted Marilla. I reckon she'll find it hard to explain that to my satisfaction. Of course, I knew you'd take her part, Matthew, but I'm bringing her up, not you. It was dark when supper was ready, and still no sign of Anne coming hurriedly over the log bridge or up Lover's Lane, breathless and repentant with a sense of neglected duties. Marilla washed and put away the dishes grimly. Then, wanting a candle to light her way down the cellar, she went up to the east gable for the one that generally stood on Anne's table. Lighting it, she turned around to see Anne herself lying on the bed, face downward among the pillows. Mercy on us, said astonished Marilla. Have you been asleep, Anne? No, was the muffled reply. Are you sick, then? Demanded Marilla anxiously, going over to the bed. Anne cowered deeper into her pillows as if desirous of hiding herself forever from mortal eyes. No, but please, Marilla, go away and don't look at me. I'm in the depths of despair, and I don't care who gets head in class or writes the best composition or sings in the Sunday school choir anymore. Little things like that are of no importance now because I don't suppose I'll ever be able to go anywhere again. My career is closed. Please, Marilla, go away and don't look at me. Did anyone hear of the light? The mystified Marilla wanted to know. Anne Shirley, whatever is the matter with you? What have you done? Get right up this minute and tell me. This minute, I say. There now, what is it? Anne had slid to the floor in despairing obedience. I like the visual of her just, she's supposed to just roll over in bed, but she slides onto the ground. Look at my hair, Marilla, she whispered. Accordingly, Marilla lifted her candle and looked scrutinizingly at Anne's hair, flowing in heavy masses down her back. It certainly had a very strange appearance. Anne Shirley, what have you done to your hair? Why, it's green. Green it might be called, if it were any earthly color. A queer, dull, bronzy green, with streaks here and there of the original red to heighten the ghastly effect. Never in all her life had Marilla seen anything so grotesque as Anne's hair at that moment. Yes, it's green, moaned Anne. I thought nothing could be as bad as red hair, but now I know it's 10 times worse to have green hair. Oh, Marilla, you little know how utterly wretched I am. I little know how you got into this fix, but I mean to find out, said Marilla. Come right down to the kitchen. It's too cold up here, and just tell me what you've done. I've been expecting something queer for some time. You haven't got into any scrape for over 2 months, and I was sure another one was due. Now then, what did you do to your hair? I dyed it. Dyed it? Dyed your hair? And surely, didn't you know it was a wicked thing to do? Yes, I know it was wicked, admitted Anne. But I thought it was worthwhile to be a little wicked to get rid of red hair. I counted the cost, Marilla. Besides, I meant to be extra good in other ways to make up for it. Well, said Marilla sarcastically, if I decided it was worthwhile to dye my hair green, I'd have dyed it a decent color. If I decided it was worthwhile to dye my hair, I'd have dyed it a decent color at least. I wouldn't have dyed it green. I didn't mean to dye it green, Marilla, protested Anne dejectedly. If I was wicked, I meant to be wicked to some purpose. He said it would turn my hair a beautiful raven black. He positively assured me that it would. How could I doubt his word, Marilla? I know what it feels like to have your word doubted. And Mrs. Allen says we should never suspect anyone of not telling us the truth unless we have proof that they're not. I have proof now. Green hair is proof enough for anybody, but I hadn't then, and I believed every word he said implicitly. Who said? Who are you talking about? The peddler that was here this afternoon. I bought the dye from him. And surely, how often have I told you never to let one of those Italians in the house? I don't believe in encouraging them to come around at all. Oh, I didn't let him in the house. I remembered what you told me, and I went out, carefully shut the door, and looked at his things on the step. Besides, he wasn't an Italian, he was a German Jew. He had a big box full of very interesting things, and he told me he was working hard to make enough money to bring his wife and children out from Germany. He spoke so feelingly about them that it touched my heart. I wanted to buy something from him to help him in such a worthy object. But then all at once I saw the bottle of hair dye. Peddler said it was warranted to dye any hair a beautiful raven black, and wouldn't wash off. In a trice I saw myself with beautiful raven black hair, and the temptation was irresistible. But the price of the bottle was 75 cents, and I had only 50 cents left out of my chicken money. I think the peddler had a very kind heart, for he said that, seeing it was me, he'd sell it for 50 cents, and that was just giving it away. So I bought it, and as soon as he had gone, I came up here and applied it with an old hairbrush, as the directions said. I used up the whole bottle, and oh, Marilla, when I saw the dreadful color it turned my hair, I repented of being wicked, I can tell you. And I've been repenting ever since. Well, I hope you'll repent to good purpose, said Marilla severely, and that you've got your eyes open to where your vanity has led you, Anne. Goodness knows what's to be done. I suppose the first thing is to give your hair a good washing and see if that will do any good. Accordingly, Anne washed her hair, scrubbing it vigorously with soap and water. But for all the difference it made, she might as well have been scouring its original red. The peddler had certainly spoken the truth when he declared that the dye wouldn't wash off. However, his veracity might be impeached in other respects. Oh, Marilla, what shall I do? Questioned Anne in tears. I can never live this down. People have pretty well forgotten my other mistakes, the liniment cake and setting Diana drunk and flying into temper with Mrs. Lynde. But they'll never forget this. They will think I am not respectable. Oh, Marilla, what a tangled web we weave when first we practice to deceive. That is poetry, but it is true. And oh, how Josie Pye will laugh. Marilla, I cannot face Josie Pye. I am the unhappiest girl in Prince Edward Island. Anne's unhappiness continued for a week. During that time, she went nowhere and shampooed her hair every day. Diana alone of outsiders knew the fatal secret, but she promised solemnly never to tell, and it may be stated here and now that she kept her word. At the end of the week, Marilla said decidedly, "It's no use, Anne. That is fast dye if ever there was any. Your hair must be cut off. There is no other way. You can't go out with it looking like that." Anne's lips quivered, but she realized the bitter truth of Marilla's remarks. With a dismal sigh, she went for the scissors. "Please cut it off at once, Marilla, and have it over. Oh, I feel that my heart is broken. This is such an unromantic affliction. The girls in books lose their hair in fevers or sell it to get money for some good deed, and I'm sure I wouldn't mind losing my hair in some such good fashion, half so much. But there is nothing comforting in having your hair cut off because you've dyed it a dreadful color, is there? I'm going to weep all the time you're cutting it off, if it won't interfere. It seems such a tragic thing." Anne wept then, but later on, when she went upstairs and looked in the glass, she was calm with despair. Marilla had done her work thoroughly, and it had been necessary to shingle the hair as closely as possible. The result was not becoming, to state the case as mildly as may be. Anne promptly turned her glass to the wall. "I'll never look at myself again until my hair grows," she exclaimed passionately. Then she suddenly righted the glass. "Yes, I will too. I do repentance for for being wicked that way. I'll look at myself every time I come to my room and see how ugly I am. And I won't try to imagine it away either. I never thought I was vain about my hair of all things, but now I know I was, in spite of its being red, because it was so long and thick and curly. I expect something will happen to my nose next." Anne's clipped head made a sensation in school on the following Monday, but to her relief, nobody guessed the real reason for it. Not even Josie Pye, who, however, did not fail to inform Anne that she looked like a perfect scarecrow. "I didn't do anything when Josie said that to me," Anne confided that evening to Marilla, who was lying on the sofa after one of her headaches, "because I thought it was part of my punishment and I ought to bear it patiently. It's hard to be told you look like a scarecrow, and I wanted to say something back, but I didn't. I just swept her one scornful look and then I forgave her." It makes you feel very virtuous when you forgive people, doesn't it? I mean to devote all my energies to being good after this, and I shall never try to be beautiful again. Of course, it's better to be good. I know it is, but sometimes it's so hard to believe a thing, even when you know it. I do really want to be good, Marilla, like you and Mrs. Allen and Miss Stacy, and grow up to be a credit to you. Diana says when my hair begins to grow, to tie a black velvet ribbon around my head with a bow at one side. She says she thinks it will be very becoming. I would call it a snood. Does that sound romantic? That sounds so romantic. But I am talking too much. But am I talking too much, Marilla? Does it hurt your head? She's finally realized. My head is better now. It was terrible bad this afternoon, though. These headaches of mine are getting worse and worse. I'll have to see a doctor about it. As for your chatter, I, I don't know that I mind it. I've got so used to it. Which was Marilla's way of saying that she liked to hear it. End of chapter. Yeah, Marilla's definitely gotten used to all the rambling after hearing so much of it. You can't help but admit that she likes it at this point, which is fair. It is very endearing. Map is done. Yeah, wow, look at that. That is really good timing. Does seem to time itself out quite nicely with the chapters. Just one more before Sunday, but that's less intense. Well, we'll do another chapter. Do 28. You're doing it tomorrow? Fair enough. We've been doing a lot of maps. We've been going for almost 3 hours now. Yeah, let's do one more, and then that'll put us at around 3 hours. And then we'll maybe wrap up, and we'll leave the rest of the chapters for the end, because there's not 40 chapters. There's less than 40, so if we just read like one more, that'll sort of split the rest of it in half. We'll do like 8 and 8 instead of instead of 10 and then less the next time. So we'll do one more. How's that sound? It's almost 11, so it's getting late. We'll do one more chapter and then we'll see how we feel and probably wrap up. All right. Chapter 28. An Unfortunate Lily Maid. Of course, you must be Elaine, Anne, said Diana. I could never have the courage to float down there. Nor I, said Ruby Gillis with a shiver. I don't mind floating down there when there's 2 or 3 of us in the flat and we can just sit up. It's fun then, but to lie down and pretend I was dead, I just couldn't. I'd really die of fright. Of course, it would be romantic, conceded Jane Andrews. But I know I couldn't keep still. I'd be popping up every minute or so to see where I was, and if I wasn't drifting too far out. And you know, Anne, that would spoil the effect. But it's so ridiculous to have a red-headed Elaine, mourned Anne. I'm not afraid to float down, and I'd love to be Elaine. But it's ridiculous just the same. Ruby ought to be Elaine because she's so fair and she has such lovely long golden hair. Elaine had all her bright hair streaming down, you know, and Elaine was the lily maid. Now, a redhead person cannot be a lily maid. Your complexion is just as fair as Ruby's, said Diana earnestly, and your hair is ever so much darker than it used to be before you cut it. Oh, do you really think so? Exclaimed Anne, flushing sensitively with delight. I sometimes thought it was myself, but I never dared to ask anyone for fear she would tell me it wasn't. I think it would be called auburn now, Diana. Yes, and I think it is real pretty, said Diana, looking admiringly at the short silky curls that clustered over Anne's head and were held in place by a very jaunty black velvet ribbon and bow. They were standing on the bank of the pond below Orchard Slope, where a little headland fringed with birches ran out from the bank. At its tip was a small wooden platform built out into the water for the convenience of fishermen and duck hunters. Ruby and Jane were spending the midsummer afternoon with Diana, and Anne had come over to play with them. Anne and Diana had spent most of their playtime that summer on and about that pond. Idlewild was a thing of the past, Mr. Bell having ruthlessly cut down the little circle of trees in his back pasture in the spring. Anne had sat among the stumps and wept, not without an eye to the romance of it, but she was speedily consoled for after all, as she and Diana said, big girls of 13, going on 14, were too old for such childish amusements as playhouses, and there were more fascinating sports to be found about the pond. It was splendid to fish for trout over the bridge, and the 2 girls learned to row themselves about in the little flat-bottomed dory Mr. Barry kept for duck shooting. It was Anne's idea that they dramatize Elaine. They had studied Tennyson's poem in school the preceding winter, and the superintendent of education having prescribed it in the English course for the Prince Edward Island schools. They had analyzed and parsed it and torn it to pieces in general, until it was a wonder there was any meaning at all left in it for them. But at least the fair Lily Maid and Lancelot and Guinevere and King Arthur had become very real people to them, and Anne was devoured by secret regret that she had not been born in Camelot. Those days, she said, were so much more romantic than the present. Anne's plan was hailed with enthusiasm. The girls had discovered that if the flat were pushed off from the landing place, it would drift down with the current under the bridge and finally strand itself on another headland lower down, which ran out at a curve in the pond. They had often gone down like this, and nothing could be more convenient for playing Elaine. Well, I'll be Elaine, said Anne, yielding reluctantly, for although she would have been delighted to play the principal character, yet her artistic sense demanded fitness for it, and this, she felt, her limitations made impossible. Ruby, you must be King Arthur, and Jane will be Guinevere, and Diana must be Lancelot. But first you must be the brothers and the father. We can't have the old dumb servitor, because there isn't room for 2 in the flat when one is lying down. We must pall the barge all its length in blackest samite. That old black shawl of your mother's will be just the thing, Diana. The black shawl having been procured, Anne spread it over the flat and then lay down on the bottom, with closed eyes and hands folded over her breast. Oh, she does look really dead, whispered Ruby Gillis nervously, watching the still white little face under the flickering shadows of the birches. It makes me feel frightened, girls. Do you suppose it's really right to act like this? Mrs. Lynde says that all play acting is abominably wicked. Ruby, you shouldn't talk about Mrs. Lynde, said Anne severely. It spoils the effect because this is hundreds of years before Mrs. Lynde was born. Jane, you arrange this. It's silly for Elaine to be talking when she's dead. Jane rose to the occasion. Cloth of gold for coverlet there was none, but an old piano scarf of yellow Japanese crepe was an excellent substitute. A white lily was not obtainable just then, but the effect of a tall blue iris placed in one of Anne's folded hands was all that could be desired. Now she's all ready, said Jane. You must kiss her quiet brows, and Anne, you say, and Diana, you say, sister, farewell forever. And Ruby, you say, farewell, sweet sister. Both of you as sorrowfully as you possibly can. And for goodness sake, smile a little. You know Elaine. Lay as though she smile. That's better. Now push the flat off. The flat was accordingly pushed off, scraping roughly over an old embedded stake in the process. Diana and Jane and Ruby only waited long enough to see it caught in the current and headed for the bridge before scampering up through the woods, across the road and down to the lower headland, where, as Lancelot and Guinevere and the king, they were to be in readiness to receive the Lily Maid. For a few minutes, Anne, drifting slowly down, enjoyed the romance of her situation to the full. Then something happened not at all romantic. The flat began to leak. In a few moments, it was necessary for Elaine to scramble to her feet, pick up her cloth of gold coverlet and pall of blackest samite, and gaze blankly at a big crack in the bottom of her barge, through which the water was literally pouring. That sharp stake at the landing had torn off the strip of batting nailed on the flat. Anne did not know this, but it did not take her long to realize that she was in a dangerous plight. At this rate, the flat would fill and sink long before it could drift to the lower headland. Where were the oars? Left behind at the landing. Anne gave one gasping little scream which nobody ever heard. She was white to the lips, but she did not lose her self possession. There was one chance. Just one. I was horribly frightened, she told Mrs. Allen the next day, and it seemed like years while the flat was drifting down to the bridge and the water rising in it every moment. I prayed, Mrs. Allen, most earnestly, but I didn't shut my eyes to pray, for I knew the only way God could save me was to let the flat float close enough to one of the bridge piles for me to climb up on it. The piles are just old tree trunks, and there are a lot of knots and old branch stubs on them. It was proper to pray, but I had to do my part by watching out, and right well I knew it. I just said, Dear God, please take the flat close to a pile, and I'll do the rest, over and over and over again. Under such circumstances, you don't think much about making a flowery prayer. But mine was answered, for the flat bumped right into a pile for a minute, and I flung the scarf and the shawl over my shoulder and climbed up a big providential stub. And there I was, Mrs. Allen, clinging to that slippery old pile with no way of getting up or down. It was a very unromantic position, but I didn't think about it at that time. You don't think much about romance when you have just escaped from a watery grave. I said a grateful prayer at once, and then I gave all my attention to holding on tight, for I knew I should probably have to depend on human aid to get back to dry land. The flat drifted under the bridge and then promptly sank in midstream. Ruby, Jane, and Diana, already awaiting it on the lower headland, saw it disappear before their very eyes, and had not a doubt but that Anne had gone down with it. For a moment they stood still, white as sheets, frozen with horror at the tragedy. Then, shrieking at the tops of their voices, they started on a frantic run up through the woods, never pausing as they crossed the main road to glance the way of the bridge. Anne, clinging desperately to her precarious foothold, saw their flying forms and heard their shrieks. Help would soon come, but meanwhile her position was a very uncomfortable one. The minutes passed by, each seeming an hour to the unfortunate Lily Maid. But why didn't someone come? Where had the girls gone? Suppose they had fainted, one and all. Suppose nobody ever came. Suppose she grew so tired and cramped that she could hold on no longer. Anne looked at the wicked green depths below her, wavering with long, oily shadows, and shivered. Her imagination began to suggest all manner of gruesome possibilities to her. Then, just as she thought she really could not endure the ache in her arms and wrists another moment, Gilbert Blythe came rowing under the bridge in Harmon Andrews' dory. Gilbert glanced up and, much to his amazement, beheld a little white, scornful face looking down upon him with big, frightened, but also scornful, gray eyes. Anne Shirley, how on earth did you get up there? He exclaimed. Without waiting for an answer, he pulled close to the pile and extended his hand. There was no help for it. Anne, clinging to Gilbert Blythe's hand, scrambled down into the dory where she sat, drabbled and furious, in the stern with her arms full of dripping shawl and wet crepe. It was certainly extremely difficult to be dignified under the circumstances. What has happened, Anne? Asked Gilbert, taking up his oars. We were playing Elaine, explained Anne frigidly, without even looking at her rescuer, and I had to drift down to Camelot in the barge, I mean the flat. The flat began to leak, and I climbed out on the pile. The girls went for help. Will you be kind enough to row me to the landing? Gilbert obligingly rolled to the landing, and Anne, disdaining the distance, sprang nimbly on shore. I'm very much obliged to you, she said haughtily as she turned away. But Gilbert had also sprung up from the boat and now laid a detaining hand on her arm. Anne, he said hurriedly, look here. Can't we be good friends? I'm awfully sorry I made fun of your hair that time. I didn't mean to vex you, and I only meant it for a joke. Besides, it's so long ago. I think your hair is awfully pretty now. Honest, I do. Let's be friends. For a moment, Anne hesitated. She had an odd, newly awakened consciousness under all her outraged dignity that the half-shy, half-eager expression in Gilbert's hazel eyes was something that was very good to see. Her heart gave a quick, queer little beat, but the bitterness of her old grievance promptly stiffened up her wavering determination. That scene of 2 years before flashed back into her recollection as vividly as if it had taken place yesterday. Gilbert had called her carrots and had brought about her disgrace before the whole school. Her resentment, which to other and older people might be as laughable as its cause, was in no whit allayed and softened by the time seemingly. She hated Gilbert Blythe. She would never forgive him. No, she said coldly, I shall never be friends with you, Gilbert Blythe, and I don't want to be. All right, Gilbert sprang into his skiff with an angry color in his cheeks. I'll never ask you to be friends again, Anne Shirley, and I don't care either. He pulled away with swift, defiant strokes, and Anne went up to the steep, ferny little path under the maples. She held her head very high, but she was conscious of an odd feeling of regret. She almost wished she had answered Gilbert differently. Of course, he had insulted her terribly, but still. Altogether, Anne rather thought it would be a relief to sit down and have a good cry. She was really quite unstrung, for the reaction from her fright and cramped clinging was making itself felt. Halfway up the path, she met Jane and Diana rushing back to the pond in a state narrowly removed from positive frenzy. They had found nobody at Orchard Slope, both Mr. and Mrs. Barry being away. Here, Ruby Gillis had succumbed to hysterics and was left to recover from them as best she might, while Jane and Diana flew through the haunted wood and across the brook to Green Gables. There they found nobody either, for Marilla had gone to Carmody and Matthew was making hay in the back field. Oh, Anne, gasped Diana, fairly falling on the former's neck and weeping with relief and delight. Oh, Anne, we thought you were drowned, and we felt like murderers because we had made you be Elaine. And Ruby is in hysterics. Oh, Anne, how did you escape? I climbed up on one of the piles, explained Anne wearily, and Gilbert Blythe came along in Mr. Andrews' dory and brought me to land. Oh, Anne, how splendid of him! Why, it's so romantic, said Jane, finding breath enough for utterance at last. Of course you'll speak to him after this. Of course I won't, flashed Anne, with a momentary return of her old spirit. And I don't ever want to hear the word romantic again, Jane Andrews. I'm awfully sorry you were so frightened, girls. It is all my fault. I feel sure I was born under an unlucky star. Everything I do gets me or my dearest friends into a scrape. We've gone and lost your father's flat, Diana, and I have a presentiment that we'll not be allowed to row on the pond any more. Anne's presentiment proved more trustworthy than presentiments are apt to do. Great was the consternation in the Barry and Cuthbert households when the events of the afternoon became known. Will you ever have any sense? Groaned Marilla. Oh, yes, I think I will, Marilla returned Anne optimistically. A good cry, indulged in the grateful solitude of the East Gable, had soothed her nerves and restored her to her wonted cheerfulness. I think my prospects of becoming sensible are brighter now than ever. I don't see how, said Marilla. Well, explained Anne, I've learned a new and valuable lesson today. Ever since I came to Green Gables, I've been making mistakes, and each mistake has helped to cure me of some great shortcoming. The affair of the amethyst brooch cured me of meddling with things that didn't belong to me. The haunted wood mistake cured me of letting my imagination run away from me. The liniment cake reminded me the liniment cake mistake cured me of carelessness in cooking. Dyeing my hair has cured me of vanity. I never think about my hair and nose now, at least very seldom. And today's mistake is going to cure me of being too romantic. I have come to the conclusion that it is no use trying to be romantic in Avonlea. It was probably easy enough in towered Camelot of hundreds of years ago, but romance is not appreciated now. I feel quite sure that you will soon see a great improvement in me in this respect, Marilla. I'm sure I hope so, said Marilla, skeptically. But Matthew, who had been sitting mutely in his corner, laid a hand on Anne's shoulder when Marilla had gone out. Don't give up all your romance, Anne, he whispered shyly. A little of it is a good thing. Not too much, of course, but keep a little of it, Anne. Keep a little of it. End of chapter. All right. That was a good chapter. that entire misadventure was just that one chapter, and it was good. Anne and Gilbert are really funny. All their interactions are really funny. And so anytime they interact, it's always a good time. Yeah, he really was cursed by his first comment about her. He made that one little mistake and he's not lived it down since, even though he's been nothing but really nice to her for like a year now. Over a year now. He's been nothing but nice, but he's really paid for that one mistake at the beginning. Poor lad. All right, what do we think? Should we? Yeah, just had to call her carrots, huh? He really didn't mean anything that mean by it, but he didn't know how much of a complex she had about her hair. Um, so didn't sit well with her, even if he didn't mean the absolute worst intention by it. He only wanted her attention, but he's ended up sabotaging himself royally. Which, to be fair, makes him a little bit like Anne. Anne does that a lot too. She does sabotage herself quite a bit. Which she's almost doing here as well, right? She's sabotaging herself a little bit here because clearly she does actually want to talk to Gilbert, and they'd probably get along quite well, as you can tell. They're a lot alike in a lot of ways, and they would probably be kindred spirits, but she's kind of sabotaging that for herself with her own stubbornness. Let's take a look at how many chapters there are left. Because we're on 29. Let's take a peek. All the way back at the top. All right, so we're right here at an epoch in Anne's life. So we don't have a lot left to go. That's why I said we should stop here. Because if we keep going all the way, then we'll have even less to read next time. So I think we should kind of split it up since there's not 40 chapters. Um, we'll hold back slightly so that there's more to read next time. Kind of split it evenly instead of doing a longer stream this time and a shorter one next time. We'll just split it in half. So we'll resume here at an epoch in Anne's life, and then we'll return. The book kind of like progresses across like time periods quite quickly because it does actually cover like a decent amount of Anne's life, or her childhood rather, all in kind of the same book. Like she's already aged several years in the course of the book, so kind of skips across seasons quite quickly, but it does it in really organic ways, so it never feels like it's rushing you through stuff. All the time when they skip, it's always because she's like broken her ankle or something. Okay, we'll return here for the next stream, and that'll probably be our last one. We'll wrap up next Friday, and that'll be the end of our first Cozy Corner book club. Now I don't know if you guys know this, but this is a this is a whole series of books. Lucy Maud Montgomery wrote a ton of these. There are quite a few books in this series. I don't know that we're just gonna go and read all the other books though. I think that's a bit extensive. Um, so I think we can just do the first and then move to a different book. We can do some Dracula, or maybe we should save Dracula for like October though. And we can move to other things, but we're not gonna immediately start another book club right now. Like it's not just gonna be immediately the week after we finish this one. I want to do some other things and do some more D&D as well. So this is just like an every once in a while thing. So we'll leave it for a month or two, and if we feel like it, we'll bring it back. Because I don't want just like a dedicated Friday is always going to be book club. Well, when are you going to do candle shade? Maybe we might do one. Or are you going to do candle shade? Yeah, we might do one after this. If I can't actually get the D&D thing the week after we finish this, so 2 weeks from now, then we'll do a candle tree instead. Keep saying I'm going to do one, but then I started doing this and I got distracted. But, well, we might not do it Friday. We can swap the Wednesday and Friday streams pretty easily. So whatever. Plus, I can do things Saturday too. It'll just be like whatever day I can get the most amount of people for a candle tree one. So it might not be Friday. All right. So the next stream will be Monday for more Three Crowns, more D&D. Let's go back over to our cozy corner. Get our cozy music. You'll fight your manager gently because we're cozy. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so the next actual stream will be Monday, 7 p.m. Eastern, for more Three Crowns Dungeons and Dragons campaign. It'll be a good time. And then the next actual Cozy Corner book club will be next Friday, unless anything randomly interferes with it and I have to move it around or cancel it. But who knows at this point? But I'll inform everybody if that happens. And we'll finish up End of Green Gables. This has been a really good time, and I really have been enjoying this book. It's quite a wonderful book. It's very relaxing to read. Very well. It's very cozy. So I'm glad that we decided to do this one. Yeah, it is a good book. Just a straight up good book. Ella Montgomery was she was spitting fire when she was writing this one down. It makes you tired, which is good, but also bad for math. Yeah, it is that kind of comfy cozy that makes you like want to just like curl up in bed and fall asleep. I noticed in there, um, there was a little instance. Did you guys notice? There's an instance in there when we flip to Marilla's perspective. And Marilla, from her perspective, the author went on to like wax poetic about the end of winter and spring coming, and sort of the environment around Avonlea and around Green Gables at that time, which is something that's not really happened from Marilla's perspective. And she says that Marilla didn't like consciously think of this, but that she still had it in the back of her head, which makes sense for Marilla. But that's kind of like the first time that Marilla's actually had that included in her exclusive little bits, right? Marilla definitely being affected by Anne there. That little bit of kind of very flowery prose about the environment just kind of being slipped into her perspective is a nice touch. I do also think it's interesting. We talked about this a little bit last time. It was maybe last time or the first stream. I don't remember. We talked about it a bit last time. How Lucy Maud Montgomery will often skip things, and then like she'll skip the event itself, and then tell us what happened from Anne's perspective instead. And she did that a little bit here too. She even skipped a little bit when describing like the boat bit when the boat was sinking. She even goes on to like tell part of that from Anne's perspective as she explained it to somebody else, Mrs. Allen. And it's an interesting thing that the author does, where she'll purposefully skip over an event. She skips the concert that they had this time. She skipped the picnic from last time and all that. She'll move past the event itself and then choose instead to just tell us the event from Anne's perspective. Like have Anne herself actually describe the event, which is really interesting. Because often you'll always hear the advice of like, oh, well, you should show something, don't tell it. And like they say that in all things. They say that in movies. They say that in books. They say it in literally any form of writing. The show don't tell. But I actually think that Montgomery gets like a better effect. I talked about this last time. She gets a better effect out of it than if she showed the event. Because a central part of the book, I mean, the book's called Anne of Green Gables, so obviously a central part of the book is understanding Anne, the main character. And so it's better to have Anne tell us what happened than to have the event shown to us, the reader. It's like more interesting to get Anne's like biased and imaginative, warped kind of story of what happened, and because it informs her character, than it is to like just see it for ourselves, right? If we saw it for ourselves, we would see, for example, Anne falling out of a boat at the picnic. or someone else almost falling out of the boat at the picnic. Sorry. We were talking about Anne falling out of a boat this time. I wasn't last time. Someone else almost falling out of the boat, but then we hear Anne recite it back instead. And it's someone almost drowning at the picnic, right? And so like her retelling the stories is more interesting because we see that what flavor she adds to it. And that tells us like kind of how she thinks of things rather than just seeing the event itself. We don't need to see it twice. So if we're going to get if we're gonna get the event, then we should get the part of it that informs Anne more. So it's interesting that she often skips the events that you imagine most authors would treat as plot beats, right? Like most people would plot out their book like, okay, and then Anne goes to the picnic, and then Anne almost falls out of a boat, and then Anne does this, and Anne has the concert, and we see Anne at the concert. And like if you were writing this for like a visual medium, like if this was a movie or a TV show or something, you couldn't do it this way, because you would have to like show the audience something. You couldn't just show Anne sitting there constantly in front of Marilla just doing long diatribes, right, and soliloquies. Like you would have to show more visual events. But through a book, you can choose to kind of like warp the way you tell the story a little bit to like inform the characters better. It's the same thing you would do if you were writing from like a first person perspective. Like you could get that kind of like tinted, like rose tinted goggles, or like biased kind of perspective if you were writing from a first person narrator. And so that's why a lot of people will write first person books, is to get the main character to sort of explain the events from their perspective and have that sort of like bias, not in like a bad sense, but just bias of like the way that they view the event and narrate the event has some like sort of character to it. And so like even though Anne of Green Gables is not written from the first person perspective, like Montgomery still gets the same effect, which is interesting and something that you don't really think about too much. She gets to like bias all the events and have that sort of narrator in the story without actually just telling it from a first person perspective, doing it all through dialogue. It's interesting. And I think it's effective because you end up knowing a lot about Anne just from the way she talks about stuff. You don't need to be inside Anne's head too much because Anne just voices it all out loud. Because even the fact that Anne voices it out loud instead of keeping it to herself is informing her character too, right? So typically when the actual like narrator is telling us about the thoughts in someone's head, it's typically honestly not about Anne. Like we very rarely get any sort of narration that's like Anne was actually thinking this, or Anne was internalizing this. It's usually Marilla or Matthew, or even sometimes Rachel Lynde. It's very rarely actually inside Anne's head, which is interesting. She's the main character. But I think it's all done really effectively, and I think it's really great. What makes it really compelling to read. No matter how much Anne rambles, it's always really interesting to read because everything she says tends to tell us something about her. So it never feels like it's just rambling for the sake of, well, Anne rambles, therefore this dialogue needs to be included. Everything she says kind of has her own perspective voiced through it. No wasted time. Even though it feels like there's not like some overarching big plot. They're not on a journey somewhere or trying to achieve some lofty goal. They're kind of just living their lives. There's no great villain or antagonist like lurking everywhere in the shadows. It's literally just a girl growing up on a farm. But it still doesn't feel like it's wasting your time because every bit of it feels like it matters, which is really interesting. Anyways, I like this book, if you couldn't tell. I'll stop rambling about it. And we can wrap up. Great book. Yeah, it is. It's a good book. It's one of the greats for a reason. Renowned for a reason. Right to ramble? Okay, well, yeah, it is my channel, so I can ramble if I want to. If you don't like it, all you have to do is click the ad. But don't do that though. Don't do it. Well, we're ending the stream anyway, so it wouldn't be that big of a deal. Alright, so yeah, like I said, next stream will be Monday, 7 p.m. Eastern for more D&D, 3 crowns. And next Cozy Corner will be next Friday, probably around 8ish or 7 or 8, depending on what I'm doing that day. Sometimes I just push it an hour later so that I can have a little bit of breathing room. So yeah, 7 or 8, I'll make the announcement the day of. You'll see. If you're new around here, follow the Twitter. You get schedule updates. Oh. What? Why did Streamlabs log me out? Well, I guess I can't type in chat. So you know what? Follow me at GrandLorian on Twitter if you want schedule updates. There you go. Thank you. I don't know why my chat logged me out. Very strange. I'll have to go resolve that after. As long as the stream didn't get interrupted, I guess it's okay. But that's unique. Not an issue I've had before. Thank you for all the links. There's the Discord there if you want to join our community. There's the World Anvil if you want to read more about my D&D world. And I think there's the archive as well if you want to go get caught up with the old streams. That includes the Cozy Corner stuff. So if you want to get caught up on the book before we finish it off, or if you just want to go back and you need something cozy to put on, then it'll be on the YouTube channel, on the archive. So check that out if you want to. You can just search my Twitch name into YouTube as well. It'll find it. All right. So I'll see you guys on Monday or potentially on Friday if you're just a Cozy Corner viewer. And take care. See you guys later. Have a good night, everybody. Thank you for watching. Goodbye. Have a good night. Take care.